So I need to, and we're gonna voice vote everything. I can see it happening. All right, so we are ready to begin the Nantucket Conservation Commission meeting for Wednesday, March 4th. We ask that everybody please silence your cell phones. If you need to have conversation, please take the conversation out into the hallway. If you'd like to come up and address the commission, please come up. State your name, sit in front of one of the microphones and talk directly into it so you're picked up on audio video. And with that, we'll take public comment on items not being heard today. Is there any public comment? Doesn't look like it. So the following items are continued. Under notice of intent, we have Chuck Rowe Nominee Trust at 25 Quays Road. That's continued until March 18th. Also under notice of intent, we have Nantucket Point of View LLC at 9 Lincoln Avenue. That's continued until March 18th. And then under certificate of compliance, we have Hardman at 41B Nantucket Road, continued until March 18th. And also Nantucket Wheelhouse LLC at 13 Massachusetts Avenue, continued until March 18th. So with that, we will begin the public hearing under notices of intent with 10 Easy Street Nominee Trust at 10 Easy Street.
Oh, and this is Maureen. I just want to say I'm on the call now.
Okay.
Hi, Maureen.
So amazingly enough, we actually have a full board despite 2 remote participants.
Good evening, Paul Santos with Nantucket Surveyors, representing the applicant, Deb Killen and William Lothian, the owners of 10 Easy Street under 10 Easy Street Nominee Trust. This is a notice of intent application that I came before you at last meeting, for which we continued as we did not have a DEP file number. We do have that DEP file number in place now. The site is not subject to any NHESP filing, so we are, I think, good to go. To refresh your memory, this is a creation of 2 pervious parking spaces at the Killen real estate property, which is at the corner of Easy Street and Cambridge Street. Resource areas are land subject to coastal storm flowage, and we are within the buffer zone also of the Easy Street bulkhead, which is the harbor itself and technically a coastal bank. So happy to answer any questions that you may have, but we do have what we need now to move forward.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the commission?
None.
Any questions from the public? Jeff, do we have everything we need to close?
We do.
Paul, would you like to close?
Yes, please.
Is there a motion?
Hello.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, so by voice vote, Phillips,
Yes.
Topham,
Topham, aye.
Golding eye.
Ayersman, aye.
LaFleur eye.
Neil, aye.
Okay, that carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now moving on to Escape Hatch LLC at 20 Western Avenue.
For the applicant, Art Gasparo. This is the second hearing for this application regarding work within the buffer zone to the coastal dune that involved the septic system upgrade, some hardscape landscape changes, and the walking path to the beach. At the last meeting, we hadn't received sign off from Natural Heritage, which we have received a letter from them requiring a conditioned approval, which we understand, would be included with the order of conditions and are amenable to. There had been discussion from the commission with respect to a pre-construction meeting, which we're also amenable to, and I believe that was the only outstanding item. I'm happy to address any additional questions or concerns that you may have.
Yeah, any questions from the commission? Questions from the public? Okay, Jeff, do we have everything we need to close?
Yes.
Art, would you like to close?
Yes, please.
Is there a motion?
Move to close.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, by voice vote, Phillips,
Aye.
Topham,
Golding eye.
Arisman, aye.
LaFleur eye.
Beal eye.
Okay, that passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now moving on to Harborfront Realty Trust at Village Way.
Thank you, Paul Santos with Nantucket Surveyors, for the applicant and property owner, Harborview Realty Trust, with Kevin F. Dale acting as trustee. This is an application for the relocation of an existing set of beach stairs within the coastal bank, coastal dune beach interface on a parcel of land located at the end of Village Way. We recently were before you for the reconstruction of a set of existing stairs located within the Village Way right-of-way, which provides access to a essentially landlocked piece of land. A little bit of history here. This is a parcel, you can see where the heavy line is on the existing plan. This is a piece of registered land. By that I mean it's a land-corded parcel with that is basically between two residential parcels in Nantucket Harbor. You have the small residence located in this vicinity here, and you have Providence Associates, or the Leibowitz residence, which is located here. This is a standalone parcel that is not held in fee ownership by either Small or Providence Associates. They've utilized the property for many years. The Smalls have owned in this area for a number of years. And these set of stairs, these stairs have all been in existence for some number of time. Both the stairs at the end of Village Way, the existing stairs that are used by Small in this vicinity here, and then the existing stairs that are used by Tulloch or Providence Associates in this particular location here. This property was sold within the last 10 years to a property owner that lives over on Village Way by the name of Larry Leibowitz. And over time, obviously, each of these units, these owners have utilized, and with past agreements with past owners, utilized the beach area where the harbor now exists. The intent here is to permit the relocation of the small stairs to where we have shown on the plan as relocated stairs. And in fact, there are two expired orders of conditions in which this work was previously permitted but never enacted upon. At one point in 2011, there was a plan to remove both the Small and Tulloch stairs and relocate this set of stairs to this location. And I believe back in 2004 or 5, there was a plan to reconstruct these stairs that had never been completed, and that's why we came before you just recently to reconstruct those stairs. The intent here is to relocate the small stairs to this particular location here, and then the three owners, Tulloch, Small, and Mr. Leibowitz, who currently owns this property here, is to come in and divide this property up. So both Tulloch and Small and Leibowitz will continue to have their own fee parcel to the mean high water line. In their way, that way, everyone has their own set of stairs with access to a beach that they have ownership to. And that's what the intent is to do here. That's why we're looking to locate these from here to here. We would then potentially come in, you would see a property line here, a property line here. This would go to Tulloch, this would go to Small, and Leibowitz would retain his piece over here. So that's what the intent of this plan is here. That really can't happen under the scenario where this set of stairs is in this location, and that's why we're looking to relocate the stairs.
Which ones were those?
This stairs here. These are the ones that Small utilizes.
Okay, yeah.
And then what we'd be doing is moving it over here. And what that does, it gives us the ability to divvy the property up in a more uniform way between the three owners. Obviously, once this is done, then they'll enter into negotiations to deal with how they're going to deal with the divvying up of the parcel. At the end of the day, the intent is to have three parcels all connected with access to the harbor. again, this is registered land, so even though these owners have used these stairs, they've used the right over time, they've acquired, because it's registered, they can't acquire adverse rights, if you will, or adverse possession. They can't claim that they've used it for a period of time and that they're entitled to it. So that's what we're trying to do. That's kind of the big picture, but that's why we're here asking to do this. We do not have a DEP file number at this point, and we have filed also with NHESP. There actually have been two previous, where there was a sign off of no take, no adverse impact for the stairs we did here. And the previous 2011 filing was a similar finding from NHESP, but we still have refiled with them and awaiting their approval. Be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I believe one of the small families is in the back here and maybe would like to speak, and we'll go from there.
Are there any questions from the commission? Paul,
One thing I was wondering, this is Maureen, would the construction of the removal and then reconstruction of the middle set of stairs, that will wait until all the land division is settled finally?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question. One of the photos that was submitted from the top of bank made it look to me like this has been getting vista pruned.
It does appear that the small property has had some vista pruning.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I think a condition of these stairs would maybe be that we can no longer see vista pruning on this site, because they shouldn't be doing it anyway, but this gives incentive to stop.
Yeah. Yeah, the applicant itself is for the non-small property, but it is somewhat, this is all connected. It is all tied together.
And since the photo submitted
Yeah.
shows it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions from the public? Okay. Commission, feeling good? So we can't close tonight. Would you like to continue for 2 weeks?
Yes.
Okay, so this will continue until March 18th.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so moving on to Summerwind Investments LLC at 14 Celtic Drive.
Thanks, Paul.
I'm not gonna start talking until I sit down. I know the rules.
Perfect, because then the mic will pick you up.
Despite the fact that you're talking, there's no talking.
This is
To not.
David Haynes for the applicant. This is a notice of intent to construct a garage with a dwelling over it, in part of which is in the buffer zone to a bordering vegetated wetland at 14 Celtic Drive. The building is outside of 50 feet from is greater than 50 feet from the edge of the wetland. The foundation will be a slab with footings, and I did look at the grades, and the grade is going to be about 17 feet, and the wetland elevation, which is about the elevation of the water table, is down around 10, so we've got 6.5 feet, so with 4 foot was going to give it, we're going to be above the 2 foot separation, so no waivers are, what I'm saying is no waivers are necessary for this, and no dewatering will have to be done. There has been some recent work on the site to fix the lawn and the portion of the driveway, which apparently rotted out, and it was re-gravelled and re-loamed and seeded, and then hydro-seeded on top of it, so it's all stable, but it was just repairing the lawn. I think that's considered routine maintenance, but I just wanted to bring it to everybody's attention. It is stable at this point. One other issue that came up the day I filed, or the day after I filed, they sold the property, and so now there's a new property owner and a new recording, and so I have made that correction. I did speak to Joe about it, and she said just bring the information in.
Yeah, that's totally
and we'll
fine.
change it on the order of conditions.
Yes.
So I do have a letter here that shows the new owners, and also I changed the first and second pages of the notice of intent.
Perfect.
The new recording information. Other than that, all disturbed areas will be seeded, and there is a proposed silt fence on there. Everything will be seeded or stabilized as appropriate, either with lawn or with gravel or shelf for driveway.
Thank
We
you.
do have a file number.
Any questions from the commission?
Yeah. I was admiring your antique map that you so how old is it?
The quad map?
This one, yeah.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
it from the 50s?
It's 79.
Is it really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my lord.
It's the most recent USGS.
Is it
quad
really?
For Nantucket.
Boy,
Yeah.
it is out of date.
Yeah. There are no houses there.
Or gravel pits left, as far as I know, where it's pretty interesting.
It was photo revised in 79.
Right, right.
All right, any other questions? 8 parking spots, huh, on this tiny little lot?
Well, 2 of those are the garage.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it speaks to a lot of humans living in this tiny little space, very close to a wetland. Any questions from the public? All right, Jeff, do we have everything we need to close?
We do.
Would you like to close?
Yes, please.
Okay, is there a motion?
Motion to close.
Is there a second?
Second.
By voice vote, Phillips?
Aye.
Topham?
Rolling eye.
Arisman, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Beal, aye.
That passes unanimously. Okay, so moving on to 51 Ocean Avenue, Nominee Trust at 51 Ocean Avenue.
Hello, Jeff Blackwell for the applicant. This project is proposes to construct a landing onto a set of existing beach stairs that have been in existence for something like 20 years, based on looking at the aerial photographs. The landing would be constructed in compliance with the 50-foot setback. In the resource area here is a coastal dune that was delineated by Stan Humphreys. So the project complies with the 50-foot structure setback to a resource area, and I've run out of details. It's somewhat straightforward.
Any questions from the commission? So I just had one question. It said that you were going to stabilize any areas after the fact with 6 inches of topsoil and like the Cape Cod seed mix. I was just concerned on the slope if that was going to be realistic.
Well, we considered proposing a beach grass to stabilize the slope, but felt that the beach grass could be slower to establish or to propagate itself. I don't know if a combination of the two might be the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I think something with roots is going to actually stabilize, where the topsoil and seed mix, one rainstorm and it's gone.
It's the potential is there for a heavy rainstorm to carry that away. Right. So I'm happy to go for a different solution.
Putting some plugs in of beach grass would probably be
okay.
Yeah.
In the short term.
Okay.
I might also say this may be a site where you consider some sort of erosion blanket on the loose soils and let the plants kind of come up through, and then let it go over time. Yeah. But you can certainly condition that in any order of conditions.
Okay. Yeah, something to stabilize just a little bit more robustly, but I agree the beach grass plugs would help.
Yeah, long term, no doubt, they're the way to go. Yeah, that root system.
Any other questions from the commission? Questions from the public? Okay. Seeing not, Jeff, do we have everything we need to close?
We do.
Move to close.
Second.
All in favor, or nope, sorry, voice vote. Phillips?
Aye.
Topham?
Golding eye.
Arisman, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Beal, aye.
That carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I would suggest, I know the applicant will request it, hearing the next two applications together.
Together, okay. So coming up, we have William F. Hopkins, trustee at 7 Hollowell Lane. And we'll hear that with Hollowell Lane Nominee Trust at 9 Hollowell Lane. And we're missing file numbers on both.
Yes, we are missing about.
For the applicant, Gasparo. These are essentially identical applications, identical resource areas, two licensed timber groins, but they exist on adjacent properties. And working for each owner, they hope to, I think, work together for, to get the work done at the same time, same contractor. But we wanted to do two applications to keep them, the orders, thank you, recorded on each of the certificates of title as well. We've tried to include a lot of background information to show that these have existed since prior to the effective date of the wetland regulations, aerial photos from 1969, the licenses, the Chapter 91 licenses for each of them. The upper portions of the beach of these two structures are actually in pretty good shape. I don't expect that it would be at all, a whole replacement, but the part that goes down into the water, there's a portion there where it's difficult to tell until you actually start excavating, where you're going to stop to tie back into the solid structure. So I wrote the applications up to be permissive to allow replacement in kind of the entire thing, paid the fee over the length of the entire structure, but would then show on an as-built exactly what portion of the structure was replaced is what we have in mind. We did receive back comments from Division of Marine Fisheries, but we have not received back comments yet from Natural Heritage. So ultimately we will be continuing. The proposed accesses from Jetties Beach. So we do understand that, there's concerns with shorebirds, in this area, fully anticipate time of year restrictions, monitoring. It would be a fairly short duration project. We would, with a rubber tire, just to explain the process a little bit, I would envision a rubber tired front end loader with forks, which would carry the materials. And then a track excavator with a vibratory head, which could be used to add a bucket, both, which could be used to remove the material and then drive in the new piles and sheeting. You may recall just in the last couple of years we've done this on a couple more of the with permits in your review to the existing groins on a couple of the properties moving to the west, and it's gone well. I've been involved and out there while they were doing the work, and the level of disturbance is really just of the beach itself, and then they rake it smooth, and we wrote in the order and would expect a condition that the beach would be raked on the way out, not on a daily basis necessarily, but clean it up after for the project. And it's really usually just kind of where they turn and maneuver that we see the bit, I guess I would call it sand rutting.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission?
Well, as a general observation, I just note there's no cross sections at all, and I'm not saying that there should be, except I don't want to see mission creep with them suddenly being a foot higher or 2 feet higher. And so how can one make sure that...
That's a good point. What I can do, I've surveyed these, and I can provide an updated plan for the next meeting that shows the elevations of the current elevations of the top of the groin. I actually should have some more elevations on there, so I'll add that to the plan. And in terms of the cross-section, I included the license, which had the cross-section, because the intent is, you know, exact same materials and there's photos. I could add, you know, the same thing that's already in the license if that was necessary, but.
Well, it's pretty obscure looking on my iPad.
Right,
I mean,
yeah. I mean, it's a very standard, nothing unusual,
Right.
you know, type of a structure, and the contractor is, you know, been instructed, it's on the plan in kind, you know, no dimensional changes of material.
Just change of creosote to pressure treated.
To pressure treated, right.
So I guess my question is similar to that. So in some areas it looks like, and especially up the beach, this thing is like completely buried almost. You're
Yep.
just seeing the top. So how far down do you think they're gonna have to excavate in some of these areas?
Again, that part I don't think is gonna actually get replaced.
Okay.
But ultimately, you know, if they have to, it could be down 8, you know, feet or so, you know, to get out some of that rotten timber to be able to then put the new timbers in. The part that what they try to do is to actually pull it out. But what happens in the rotted sections is that some of that material, you know, is what I've seen as we've worked on the other ones. The parts that hold together well, that can happen. And then the stuff that is rotten and spongy, they essentially are able to drive through with the new sheets.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
I have one, Art. Is the photograph, is that at the high water mark? Or is that, are you shooting it at low tide so we can, I can't tell how much is exposed at low tide?
At low tide, I would say, you know, the very end still goes in, you know, into the water. So we would be working on, you know, essentially wet sand in the intertidal zone at low tide using an excavator to reach out. You know,
It appeared to have worked because it's almost buried.
yeah, the groins are effective in holding the beach. But there's other impacts long understood up and down the beach for them.
Yeah, I just want to go on record saying that I know that these are licensed groins, and those are prepared and replaced in kind, and it's in an area where there's other existing groins to the properties adjacent. Our regulations do say that we should be looking for environmentally better solutions for timber, for bulkhead and groin replacement. And I think moving forward, we need to see plans coming in with those alternative analyses.
Yeah, because I have to say, I wonder how much sand this is actively catching now, or was all its work done initially? Now the beach is built up a lot higher, you know, on all sides, and it's not necessarily functioning to catch sand as much anymore.
My observation to that is that it's seasonal, because as the beach goes up and down vertically, then it also, you know, catches more sand in the summer months, you know, seaward a bit. So, and as was mentioned, there is another set of groins further to the east and a few more to the west. There's also a provision within the licenses that the licensee is responsible to maintain the structures. So I think that part of it is, you know, essentially what they're doing. I understand the point, and I understand that if I was coming in for any extension or anything new, then I would fully expect that sort of other standard to apply.
Any other questions from the commission?
Yeah, this is Maureen. My question is, I think it's kind of related. Where I was, especially looking at the photographs, my first thought was, well, why, you know, is this necessary to be done to accomplish the purpose that the groins were first put in for? You know, assumedly was erosion control, and so I'm, you know, it's. And I know maintenance is important to do, but I guess I'm just having, I don't, you know, other than getting rid of rotten wood and is it? I know they have an existing license. Is it just to maintain that existing license, and is there really, what's the real impact of these groins as they are now, and with the conditions as they have changed in the many years since they were built?
I think that exactly what you said in terms of getting the rotten wood out of there before it starts, or more of it is lost to the marine environment. It does, I think that with the groins, the ends are never completely as effective. So if we end up with the end further seaward, then the beach will also be, further landward, then the beach will also be further landward, and we'll all move. So, I think that that's all part of the reason for, maintaining what was licensed is also, I think, an important aspect of it to the property owners.
Okay.
I kind of
Thank you.
have a follow-up to that. Is this the first maintenance that's been done since the initial install?
No, I included an order of conditions
okay.
in the application. I want to say,
1996.
yeah,
Okay.
right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I mean, yeah,
When
we're looking
was
at
that? I'm sorry.
1996.
The date of the earlier maintenance?
1996, Maureen.
96, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
so the estimated life is probably 20-25 years.
Yeah, I would say if not, maybe a little bit more.
Great. Any other questions from the commission?
I just want to support Ian's comment about elevations of the
Yep.
existing drawing, so we know there's no, I like, vision creep is a good word for it.
Absolutely.
Are there any questions from the public? Yes. Yes, and state your name.
Edie Ray, I want to apologize first of all, because I honestly, even sitting right over there, can't hear everything that's happening here. So if this question has already been answered, I apologize. I was an endangered species monitor for both the town of Nantucket and also for Mass Audubon. And I know that in past years, unfledged piping plover chicks have left the Jetties Beach area and have actually moved up that Hollowell groin area that we're talking about. So I have concerns as to whether or not, first of all, when this project is going to be happening timing-wise, and also how that's going to affect the ability of flightless piping plover chicks that are that big to move across the beach, even at a high tide. So
Yeah, so this is still up for heritage review, so they will probably give the time of year restrictions to protect the plovers.
Okay.
So just to add to that really quickly, typically the time of year restriction on any of these projects begins at April 1st and then doesn't end until August 31st. Sometimes it will go into September where no work is able to be done.
right, but as Jeff full well knows, that sometimes the piping plovers don't adhere to that schedule, and they're still unfledged chicks at that time, even after the drop dead date.
So with this too, is even with the heritage, is they still have to maintain compliance with the guidelines. So if they're unfledged chicks, that vehicle restriction and with access being from the Jetties Beach area would still be subject to that. So even if that time of year restriction in the order had run, they would still be subject to the provisions of the piping plover and turn guidelines. And if vehicle access is still closed, they wouldn't be able to access to do that work until those are
Good,
lifted.
and that answers the question about timing, but I do have a question about the height of the groins, because at that location, I do recall there was one instance, or one summer, where the birds did head up that way with flightless piping plover chicks, and they would get trapped in those areas at high tides, not being able to leap over the height of the groin at its landward side. So I would just want to throw that out there for your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Without making light of it at all, is there such a thing as piping plover ramps that you could put on it? You know, I mean, if necessary. It looks. It doesn't look like much of a hazard from the pictures, but I'm
Right.
certainly not going to contradict Edie, so.
We certainly could make sure that the upper portion of the groin the sand is brought level, at least, at the completion of the project, per se, the last, I'll come up with something on the plan, perhaps, maybe 20 feet or something. It's already pretty much there, as you can see from the pictures, but,
To make sure it
right.
remains that way.
Sure.
I think
Well,
there was-
I would say, if I could, at the point of after construction,
Yeah.
because once we're done, what nature does, we're not gonna, we don't want a condition that says you have to keep putting sand down there to maintain a plover ramp, if you will. But certainly finished construction, the idea and hopefully would be that, for some period of time, that sand would remain and be in a equilibrium state as well. The repaired groins may also help hold that too.
So I would say too, it may be prudent to wait and see what conditions Heritage comes back for this project too. And then if you guys have to supplement, that's certainly possible. But they may have an additional idea or some additional guidance for what to do about that situation.
Yeah, I mean, there was a permit recently for 11, I think. How long? 13?
13, yeah.
And it had definitely some things to say about how that's in the actual habitat of pepper plovers, and there was time of year restrictions, and we'll see what else they come back with, but it's a guide at least to think about.
I mean, this is the same area where they started doing for the sand drift fencing, angle cutting posts to minimize perching habitat and doing things. So they seem to be increasing the amount of conditions that they're putting on projects in actual known habitat. And so I would anticipate that they would have some level of comment to review and base conditions off of, including their own conditions that they've imposed on the project.
Okay. It looks like we have another public comment.
Burton Balkan, I had two questions. First one is this a completely redoing? I had trouble hearing too of the groin. Is this going to be, or you you said you're taking out the parts that just rotted? Is that the
Through you, Madam Chair. Yes, we would, from moving from the seaward end landward, whatever is rotten until we hit a point that it is still structurally stable.
Okay, that's what I thought I heard you say.
Tie into that.
Okay, and then this next question might be for the staff. Is there anything in the regulations that says that in a groin there has to be maintain access in the intertidal zone for projects like this, or
So our current regulations don't, but that's part of the purpose of the Chapter 91 licensing, is to maintain that access component and review it for an access component in relation to essentially the public trust doctrine that Chapter 91 is guided by. So when they license that would have been something that was contemplated as part of that licensing procedure.
And then is there anything you can put in the conditions that they can maintain access in the intertidal zone for this project?
I don't believe we'd have the ability to supersede the Chapter 91
Okay,
license.
thank you.
I think their Chapter 91 license is legally requiring them to do that, and if they are, it's not.
This is an old permit. This isn't a new one, so.
But I guess another question would be, because it's being redone, is there any way we can revisit that, or is that just it's an old?
Well, I think as far as Chapter 91 is concerned, not really. I think that's one of the reasons concerns have been brought up about the height of this thing, so that people hopefully could step over it or be able to get around it.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. Is it worth asking town council for a definitive opinion?
Maybe ask him in the next 2 weeks before he comes back.
Is that possible, Jeff?
I can certainly ask.
Yeah.
It doesn't hurt to ask the question.
Whether it seems to make sense that part of the condition would be to make sure that there's access within the intertidal zone.
Any other questions from the public? Okay, seeing not, Commissioner, are we all set? Okay. Would you like to continue for 2 weeks?
Yes, please.
Okay, so these will continue until March 18th.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, moving on to Kim Glowacki at 46 Easton Street.
Thank you.
All right, good evening. My name is Dan Wells with Goddard Consulting. I'm here with the applicant, Kim Glowacki. We have filed a notice of intent for 46 Easton Street. You can see a plan in front of you. I have it up on the board. If that's easier, I can walk you through it. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out we do have a DEP file number 48-3285. The project is not located within priority habitat or ACEC designated area. I also wanted to point out we got some comments back from Jeff regarding a couple administrative or regarding the wetland boundary delineation, so I'll address those. Thanks to Jeff for getting those to us quickly. And then, so first of all, Jeff had suggested that the plan didn't indicate there was coastal bank. There's an existing wood bulkhead structure, which it's right in this area. So that the plan, Bracken Engineering just hadn't labeled that as such, so they've already created a new plan with that change, but I'm not going to submit that because there's another change based on Jeff's comments. I went out and took another look at Jeff had suggested part of the coastal dune was actually beyond the staked area where the Japanese knotweed is, and so I adjusted the flags. So I'll show you how that might affect the existing conditions. But so, well, why don't I get right into the existing conditions then? So, put this up here. So. This side is the existing condition.
Madam Chair, the microphone is going to
Yeah,
be
you're
an
gonna have
issue
to
here.
turn-
You want to take the easel? You can
You
put
might
that
be able
on
to
it.
use the easel. I don't know, commissioners, are we okay with the plans that we
you can
have
see it?
down?
Yeah,
And
we
maybe
have
that
it. I think
can
we can
face
see
the
it. Thank
audience
you.
and they can see it?
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
All right, so on the left side of your plan is the existing condition. So there's the existing resource areas are coastal beach, coastal dune, and coastal bank. There's also land subject to coastal storm flowage, which is indicated by the gray dash line. On the harbor side is zone VE, elevation 10. On the opposite side is zone AE, elevation 7.
So where is the break there between the VE and the AE zone?
So this gray
Okay.
dash line right here. And that's, based on the FEMA firm panels.
Okay, thank you.
So the coastal dune is shown in this green color. And so I took another look this afternoon and I agreed that there was an area just beyond CD 1, 2, and 3 where right by 1 and 2 there's some Japanese knotweed growing. And so the comment, was suggested that maybe the bank included some of that knotweed. So what I did was put a revised CD 1. So it's called 1R, and it's essentially, we would eliminate CD 1, 2, and 3, and then connect to CD 4. So it pulls CD 1 up about 15 to 18 feet to about this area. So the new coastal bank line,
Coastal dune line.
I'm sorry, coastal dune line
Straight
shifts.
across the lawn line.
So it shifts about from 1 to 1R is about at least 15 feet, maybe as many as 20. So that'll be resurveyed by Bracken Engineering so that you'll get a revised plan. But realistically, that doesn't shift, it doesn't change much for the buffer zone because it's already based off this flag number 3. So, but what it does, just that minor change actually increases the amount. This plan shows the amount of structure that's within the 25-foot buffer. So there's actually more there's 403 square feet of the existing building are within the 25-foot buffer. So that number is going to go up, you know, maybe by 10 square feet or so. So that's the existing condition. And I understand at least some of the commissioners were able to go out on a site walk. Just for your use, in case you haven't seen it, I just have a photograph. This is looking from the ferry. You can see clearly that there's pretty significant structures. That's the White Elephant. There's a residential building. So there's pretty substantial development on this whole strip of Easton Street. But you can see at 46 Easton Street, that's the existing coastal bank. And then there's the coastal beach. So it's pretty unique in that it has kind of a nice natural beach present. And so the project, as I'll describe, is going to improve over the existing conditions. So I also wanted to point out that this site is within a mapped historic filled tideland by DEP. And the implications of that are it requires an automatic Chapter 91 license. It also requires an ENF with MEPA. So given those, knowing that Chapter 91 is a pretty significant constraint, the applicant and we went in and actually met with DEP Waterways back in November to kind of get a sense from them as to what's a permittable, licensable project under the Chapter 91 regs. I realize that's not under your purview, but it is important because we got guidance from them suggesting that by creating the lower floor of the buildings to be entirely dedicated to boat storage and other water-dependent uses, that would qualify this project. It would exempt it from the 100-foot automatic setback from the mean high tide line. So again, I understand this is an application under the bylaw and Wetlands Protection Act, but I wanted you to have that history of the reasoning behind the initial design. So what the project is proposing is, on the right side of your plan, a portion of the existing residence is going to be relocated back to the rear here, and the rest will be torn down. There's going to be 2 separate single-family dwellings. There will be a proposed studio. There's an existing cottage up towards the edge of Easton Street. So the setbacks from the buffers are shown on this. The new dwellings would be entirely outside of the VE, the velocity zone. They would be entirely outside of the 25-foot buffer. So we don't have, again, the project complies with all of the Wetlands Protection Act regulations regarding setbacks from coastal bank and coastal dune. It also complies with the regulations there are not regulations for work within the land subject to coastal storm flowage. Under the bylaw, the performance standards for coastal dunes, based on the feedback we got from DEP, we designed this project to comply with that water dependency criteria. So that's where so the bottom floor, so we have the architect, this is Brooke. So he can describe kind of what that visually is going to look like and the reasoning behind that, the ground floor design. But so initially we're requesting that the commission consider that this project qualifies as a water dependent project. If so, it would meet all of the performance standards for coastal dune and coastal bank. And I realize Jeff had brought up some, he thinks it's worth taking a look at that definition. I'm happy to read that definition from the bylaw if that's helpful. I can read that. So according to the bylaw, water-dependent uses are projects which require direct water access for their intended use and therefore cannot be located out of the area subject to protection under the bylaw. Examples include, but are not limited to, docks, piers, boat landings, boathouses, marinas, stairs to beaches, and boardwalks over wetland vegetation. Projects which benefit from wetlands access but which do not require it are not water-dependent uses. Examples include restaurants, dwellings, and commercial enterprises servicing marine-related uses such as fish markets, repair facilities, ships, chandleries, and general use recreational trails. So I guess, first of all, we'd like to get some feedback from the commission in terms of, well, if you'd like to hear more about the design, how that may, fit into the criteria for that definition. Brooke can kind of give you a picture of what that's intended to look like. But again, this was based on the feedback from DEP in terms of they're considering it water dependent.
I think it's prudent to hear about the design, but in the local regulation that you just read out, it specifically says that dwellings are not considered water dependent use, and what you've come in here proposed are 2 dwellings. So I don't see how it could possibly be a water dependent use.
So I agree, but let's let them finish and hear from the architect, and then we can hear commissioners' comments. So would you like to share the design?
All right, so right now it's
And sorry, can you state your name into the mic?
Brooke Meerbergen. All right, right now this is very conceptual.
You need
near
to
the mic,
talk
please.
very close to the mic. Thank you.
This is very conceptual right now, but basically because of the required elevation above the high water mark, you've got about 7-8 feet of space underneath the first floor, which will lend itself to a boathouse or boat storage type of situation in both structures. And these are not two. I mean, there are 2 structures there, but there is it's two different properties, and so each of them does have the same opportunity for a boat or marine support storage area underneath it. And I think that's does that sound but there's plenty of room to make that happen. I don't think there's a question of whether or not we'd be able to achieve that from a design point of view.
Do you have conceptual drawings?
No, I have nothing. This was sprung. I only learned about this suggestion yesterday afternoon, and there's no way that I could come.
Yeah, Seth, can just wait with the back and forth and let them kind of finish their whole spiel, and then we can take commissioners' comments.
So that's what I have right now. I mean, I could sketch it for you right now, but I don't think that would be very helpful.
So beyond the question of whether it meets the definition under the bylaws of water dependent, we also would ask if the commission feels that that's not appropriate. We also would we can propose a waiver request under the bylaw, and so part of the project includes removing that patch of Japanese knotweed that I mentioned, and I've also included a restoration plan. So we feel, even aside from the water dependency issue, the project is going to be a clear net benefit to the resource area. We're pulling that, the existing structure is only 12 feet, I think, from the dune. It's going to be pulled back to about 30 feet. So just that in of itself is a significant improvement. There's the reduction of about just over 400 square feet of impervious surface within the 25-foot no disturb or 25-foot buffer. And on top of that, the eradication of that on-site patch of Japanese knotweed, which, as we all know, that can continue to spread out to adjacent properties. So we also, the approach of requesting a waiver under the bylaw is something that we're considering, and I can get into analysis of how we might meet the criteria for a waiver, but essentially to paraphrase, the commission would have to find that the project would not adversely affect the resource areas. I think by keeping it 25 feet away, we would probably satisfy that. On top of that, we would have to demonstrate a net benefit, and that's what I just mentioned. We're reducing the impervious surface, pulling it back from the resource area, and eliminating the invasive species and planting native shrubs. And finally, there's a part in the waiver requirements regarding pre-existing disturbed conditions on the property, which this is present at this property with the existing structure. So I guess I would throw that out to you as well in considering a waiver from the regulation. Aside from that, we comply with all of the state regulations and all of the other the regular bylaw regulations, performance standards.
All right, so now I'll open it up to questions or comments from the commission.
I have a question.
This is Commissioner Topham. So, are we doing a restoration from the CD flags down to the high water mark? And if that's the case, I don't see any way that you would be able to get a boat or footpath or anything from that area. There's nothing shown on the fracking plan.
The restoration area where these knotweed are not shown on the existing conditions plan. It's generally CD1 and CD2, and it extends landward towards the existing dwelling. So I calculated it's about 500 square feet in extent. There may be a few feet spilling back towards the beach itself, but for the most part, it's landward of the coastal dune. But as I mentioned earlier, I did revise the flagging, so maybe a third of the knotweed patch is now considered within the coastal dune, but that's all landward of the beach.
Okay, so just looking at the fracking plan, it looks like that there would be plantings in the coastal beach area from the high water mark up to the CD flags. That's a little confusing looking at that plan.
I think you're just looking at the icons. It's just a wetland symbol. Yeah, I think that's.
I didn't know if that was new planting that was going to be proposed later on, and it was mistakenly put on the existing plan, or what was happening.
It's just a symbol just to represent that it is a wetland resource area. We could certainly remove that to clarify that.
Yeah, I think definitely submitting a revised plan with cleaned up lines, showing the knotweed, showing the correct resource area boundaries and the buffer zones that they cast will be important for us.
That would be
Sure.
extremely helpful.
Yeah.
I have a question related to the proposed removal method for Japanese knotweed that's indicated. I see that it's been suggested to do that with manual removal, but I wonder if you think that is sufficient. Usually we see a chemical application being applied.
Sure. Different conservation commissions have preferences. So a lot of my experience has been they prefer no herbicide use, but I understand how aggressive knotweed is. In this case, it's not. It's a relatively small area that may be able to be managed by hand, but if the commission is open to, a mini excavator or whatever, certainly we have whatever it takes to get way down into the rhizomes to completely dig it out. That we can certainly adjust that.
I personally think it's less of a disturbance of the resource to do like a clip and drip style herbicide treatment. I was able to go on the site visit, and it did seem like at some point somebody had already cut stalks, and it's not a huge area, obviously, so I think that's a more effective way of getting rid of knotweed.
Okay, sure.
Any other questions from the commission?
Well, under our local bylaws, we don't really encourage construction within the 50-foot demarcation, and without architectural drawings showing that in fact it's not a dwelling, that it's a boathouse, I think we're somewhat stymied, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, I see this now that it's subdivided as almost being completely new construction.
Right.
You know, and I also, you know, to what Seth was saying earlier, I also question that space under the house is supposed to be left open sometimes for flow through and to absorb floodwater. So if we're storing boats under there, then that kind of ruins the reason that you have that open space, right? Because if floodwaters come under there and you're storing boats, they're gonna rise up with the floodwater. So that wouldn't actually be a reasonable spot to be storing boats.
Yeah, I apologize for cutting you guys off and not following the process, but I'm concerned about what type of boats will be there, seeing more architectural drawings, concepts, you know, what are we talking about? Kayak racks? Are we talking about what are we talking about here to get a better sense of what that space is, to wrap my head around that bylaw, but I've definitely some reservations.
This is Maureen, and I share the various concerns that have been expressed. And when you look at, yes, the buildings are being moved landward, but the amount of ground coverage now has increased dramatically, and we have slabs. I mean, I guess the architectural stuff is very important, because these dwellings / boathouses, what have you, are it just excuse me, it kind of looks like that there's you've got an exemption, a possible exemption for a water dependent use, but this seems to be the water dependent use is the tail wagging the dog here. And so these architectural drawings and how this is going to be based, and everything, especially that Ashley just mentioned, I have real concerns about this amount of development on a spot that is obviously so within so many of the different boundaries of our protected areas. So there's looking forward to getting a lot more information on this before we can make any kind of determination.
Any other questions before I open it to the public?
Yeah, I just have one more question about the wooden bulkhead that's functioning as a coastal bank, and I see where it terminates on the plan. Out at the site visit, where the potential terminus was kind of, it intersected with the coastal dune and beach area, and it looked to me like it possibly went underneath the ground and continued further, but I was wondering if you're able to survey it down and see what the actual terminus of that bulkhead was, because I think it might potentially go farther than is drawn on the plan.
Yeah, I didn't look at that. I think we did a lot of research on the possible Chapter 91 licenses for this property, and there may be a drawing showing that, but I think it probably does continue. But I think it's covered up by the dune, so I don't think it would matter in terms of the resource area boundary. But we could certainly try to provide more information on maybe when it was built, what its extent was initially.
Maybe older aerial photos might show.
Sure. Okay.
All right, so I'm gonna open it up to the public for questions. Any questions from the public? Okay, so you're gonna need to get some mic space.
Thank you. My name is Marianne Hanley. I represent David Frisbee, the owner of 42 Easton Street Nominee Trust, which is the immediate abutter to this property. My clients are aware that this property is, I believe it's under agreement for sale, and they certainly would like to see something done with the existing house. Nothing's been done there for a really long time. It needs some help, but they also want a project that's consistent with the neighborhood, which is essentially residential uses on much larger lots. This is to be subdivided with 3 houses being present as opposed to the 1 house and the small cottage now. The plan that's here, the Bracken plan, shows a different subdivision line than what was approved at the planning board. So I'm not sure which plan they're going to actually use or if they're going to go back to the planning board, but we would like some clarification on where the lot lines are and what the ground coverage is proposed for each structure. The house that's there now was also denied a demolition permit by the HDC. I believe that the
So
applicant's
we do need to focus on wetland issues.
No, but I'm just saying, you know, they're, with these structures with this new ground cover going to be a certain place, I'd love to see some plans. You know, what's it gonna look like? There are scenic wetland views. You can see from the harbor, you can see clear back to the marsh across the street on Easton Street, and from Easton Street, this is probably one of the only areas where you can actually still, you know, see a fair expanse of the harbor. So I think it'll be really important to see that, the elevations. You've talked a bit about this whole water dependency thing. I mean, when I read the DEP regulations and the local bylaws, I just don't see how a residential structure fits into this. But, you know, I'm willing to listen to hear what you have to say. Mr. Topham raised a good point. How are you going to get these boats from the boat storage area into the water? Drag them over the dunes? There's really no landscaping shown on any of these plans. We're going to have a tremendous amount of new roof runoff. Easton Street, unfortunately, has been flooded pretty much every week over the past couple of years. It's been the subject of some articles in the NINM. The Nantucket Preservation Trust had a symposium and said because of rising water levels and storm damage, Easton Street might be gone in 2040, which isn't that far away. So again, my clients would like to work with the applicant, but again, they want to see really what's the picture, what is going to be going on here. And again, we'd love to have a lot more input about this, you know, boat storage thing. It seems a little specious. It's almost like anybody that has a garage with their boat stored in it, it becomes a water dependent use. I don't know if that's what was intended by the bylaw or the state law. So I would just ask that the commission review the revised plan. It's great that they're coming in with a new one. And maybe we can get a little bit more information on the boat storage. And, you know, what are the plans for the runoff, the roof runoff, et cetera, onto Easton Street? We don't want to see that flooding problem exacerbated. You can't even walk down the street some days. You have to go down in the middle of the cars because there's water on either side.
So I have a question for you. You said your clients have the house at 42 Easton Street?
Yes. There's 2 houses there. It was the Breakers.
So it covers about 85% of the lot.
Yes, it
It's
does.
absolutely massive.
Mm-hmm.
So
I agree.
if they're worried about the view, maybe they should reduce the size of the house.
I'll approach them with that. One other thing, I can give this to Dan, but actually picked up a copy of the plan that was at the Registry of Deeds that's referenced on the Bracken plan. And it shows, it's an old 1917 plan that actually shows that bulkhead going across here. But again, I'm not sure where the modern day lot lines are. So,
Okay.
I mean, I'm happy
Yeah, and that'll have to go
to
to
give it
a
to you,
copy
so
to
you have it.
Jeff.
If you pass it all the way down to me, I'll make sure.
But again, Dawn would have to check, and because I know the lot lines have changed since 1917.
Okay.
I
Thank
don't
you
want
for
to have the
that.
wrong ones on there.
Okay.
But I think that's it.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know that mic's on. I think it's a dead mic. That's why it was, yeah.
Okay. So my name is Kim Glowacki. I am the applicant. I wanted to try to give you some information tonight as to the water dependency. The first thing I can say is I am 3rd generation Nantucket native. My children are the 4th generation.
I'm sorry. I appreciate that, but
Yeah.
we've got to stick to wetlands.
Well, she wanted some information.
I know, but
She
it
wanted
has
me-
to go through this chair right here, and we've
Okay.
got to stick to wetlands.
Okay. Didn't I hear the commission want to have some more input about why it's got to be water dependent and have questions about the boat storage and what was going to be stored? So I was going to address that.
So let's we don't
Okay.
need family generational stuff.
Well, okay. So what we'd like to store down there is anything and everything that's related to the water activities, from paddle boards to kayaks to fishing equipment to small boats, whether they be dinghies for larger boats that are moored out in the ocean. We're pretty much a big water orientated family, and that's why we have interest to construct a dwelling on that site, so we have access to the water and have use to have our abilities. It's anything from fishing to having gear for cohogging, clamming. We take advantage of everything that there is to do with the water. So it's not just going to be boat storage. And I don't think we really had any intentions to bring the boats that are stored in the basement in the first level directly across the property to the ocean. We would take them out the driveway and then take them around to Children's Beach. So there was no intention of having any larger boats or any such to go down.
Yeah, so that kind of negates the reason for being so close to the water for these buildings if the boats aren't directly needing access to that water.
So when I say that, I'm relating to like a larger boat, if I had a 19-foot boat on a trailer, but the smaller stuff would want to go down and have a footpath to get to the ocean.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from the public? Okay. Commissioners, do you have any more questions? Okay. So you've got a lot of questions to answer before you come back.
Sure.
Would you like to continue for 2 weeks or longer?
Yeah, we'd like to attempt to come in 2 weeks.
Okay, so that'll be March 18th.
March 18th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's ours, though?
Yes.
Okay, so we're gonna move on to amended order of conditions, Sheep Commons LLC at 214 Pulpus Road.
Jeff Blackwell for the applicant. This plan is sheet 1, which shows the existing conditions on the property, and over here there's sheet 2. So I'll get you I'll get you also a sheet 2 showing the proposed conditions on both sides. This is a property that was reviewed by the commission in 2019, and a order of conditions was issued for the replacement of the failed septic system, and the the permit that was issued was to install a enhanced treatment, fully complying septic system. That septic system has been installed, and in the time since the permit was issued, there was been a evaluation of the house that was built in I believe the early 60s by an architect, and the house is in very poor condition, and it was decided that a better approach would be to remove the existing structure and replace it with a smaller structure. The effect of the replacement of the old structure would be to reduce the amount of structure within the buffer zone by about 542 square feet. And also the proposed structure is just a 2-bedroom dwelling, whereas the existing structure is a 4-bedroom dwelling. So it's sort of a rare application where everything is getting smaller, further away from the wetlands. And in fact, the existing structure is slightly within the 50-foot setback to the wetlands, whereas the proposed structure would fully comply with a 50-foot setback. So it's a project that is I think a net benefit is pretty clear.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission?
I have one, Ashley. Jeff, it's Joe Topham. Is there any thought or consideration to remove or relocate the existing sand driveway? You know, squeeze in between the 250s? I'm just worried about the construction debris coming and going. If trucks are set so close to, you know, flag 12 and 11 and 10. Any thoughts?
That has not been considered. We could, I would think that the owner would rather not reconstruct the driveway, but silt fencing and hay bales can certainly be installed along the wetland side of that existing driveway.
Yeah, I think maybe marking out where construction cars can park.
Yeah.
That are outside of certainly the 25.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point. There's certainly a limited amount of space to work, but once the existing house comes out, they'll actually create parking spaces for construction vehicles. I can designate those on a plan if you'd like, and it could be part of the conditions.
Yeah, could we include that?
I think that'd be great.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the commission?
I have one. Jeff, is this one of the new septic systems or AI system?
It is, yes. Yeah, it's the Septitech, which is one of the commonly used IA systems.
IA, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from the commission? Open it up. Are there any questions from the public on this one? Okay. So is there a motion to amend the order, adding in a silt fence and hay bales and some designated construction parking?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, by voice vote, Phillips.
Maureen? Nope.
No, all right. Topham?
Aye.
Golding, aye.
Arisman, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Beal, aye.
It's like we lost one.
Oh, is it wrong?
Someone hit their head?
Thank you. I'm
Scaling
sorry?
down? Someone hit their head? It's unusual to have it reduced.
I know. There's gonna be a pool next. All right. Right. So moving on in the amended orders, Richard Berman at 272 Pulvis Road.
Thank you.
Good evening again. David Haynes for the applicant. This is a recent filing that we came in with last summer to repair the septic system, and that was approved. As the Board of Health has reviewed the application, the filing, they've asked that we install a new well that was not included. We were planning on using the old well. And there's a new location that meets the 100-foot setback for the separation for the well to the septic system. Is that right?
Yes, sorry.
So we have shown a new proposed well over right along the edge of the driveway in a lawn area. I was wrong in my letter. I thought it was at the 50-foot setback. It's actually at the 25-foot setback. This area it drops down steeply and then there's a slight vegetated area before it goes to the wetland. But we will surround it with silt fence and drill the well over there. The reason we hadn't suggested drilling a new well is this site has a history of lousy water and very difficult to get water. There's a lot of clay. It's difficult to get water, and when you do, it's high iron and manganese. But at the Board of Health's request, we're going to try that location. And so that we're asking to amend the order of conditions. I didn't ask for a well before, I should have, and then we could have done a minor mod. But so that's the only change that was from the approved plan, was just this new well right along the edge of the driveway.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the commission?
Well, yeah. So do you feel the hay bales will be able to contain everything that comes out of when they're drilling? I mean, it's a pretty messy process, isn't it?
They should contain it so it stays and does not go, and that does. I assume he's using drive and wash, but which they can direct the flow of the water coming out of the well, out of the hole, towards the driveway or towards the silt sack if they have to.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think we should condition that. Or,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no runoff towards the wetland.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, those guys
That's
are
that's the intention.
Yeah. But right.
They use hawkers. They use drive and wash.
I don't know what
Yeah.
in different circumstances, very different.
A vacuum cleaner.
Yeah.
I know somebody who uses a
I
vacuum.
think you could simply condition it to say that no discharge from drilling the well can go towards the resource.
Yeah.
That's all. Doesn't matter what method.
Right, right.
They can't do it.
Right. And make sure they're aware of it. Yeah.
Any other questions from the commission?
I just wonder if we're gonna get like a permit drawing of the well, how deep it's gonna be, the width, or anything like that.
No, they go down until they hit the water, and then they go below it and they look for water. So it's gonna be a 6-inch well or a 4-inch well, but we don't usually provide more of a, and it's you find that information out when you drill it. So we can't design that ahead of time.
They have an idea, but they don't.
Yeah. And I know, speaking to a well driller that's worked on this property, it's been very difficult to find good sources.
700 feet down, you know.
Then you're back into salt
Yeah, you're in the
water.
ocean.
You're below the lens.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, there's a geological lens, right, at 750, I think.
Well, people say that the water real deep comes from New Hampshire.
There we go.
Yeah.
All right.
They do, I don't quite go along with
Sure.
that.
All right. Any other pertinent questions?
I'm not saying that.
Questions from the public? Okay. So is there a motion to approve the amended order?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
So by voice vote, I'll try Phillips one more time.
Sorry, I'm back on this time, sorry.
Topham,
Aye.
Golding eye.
Arisman, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Bill abstains as an abutter.
Okay, so that is unanimous with Commissioner Beal recused.
Thanks, sir.
Okay, so moving on to minor modifications, Key Bank National Association at 14 Washing Pond Road.
Mark Gasparo for the applicant. Before you tonight, request a minor modification for a relocation of a what was a construction access, but is now going to be a maintenance access to provide sand cover over a fiber roll array. And the same plan as before you, just one of them has an aerial underlay, which I thought may help show it a little bit better. While I've shown the entire project, the only aspect that's within the jurisdiction of the commission is really, you can see the 100-foot buffer zone is here. So it's really just moving from, it's probably a little clearer on the white plan, taking this piece where it was approved within your jurisdiction and moving it there. But ultimately what we're doing is, instead of coming straight from the driveway, there's a way, so we're gonna come around the property so we don't have the impacts right there. And ultimately, I think that there's already a wide cleared path right here. It also puts us right in the center of the project for distributing the sand. So it's really just a shift from this spot to this spot as far as the commission jurisdiction goes.
Is any of this within heritage?
It is, and it's pending. I filed with them. That's the other reason I showed the whole thing. This is the plan I sent to them.
Yeah, because I would be more comfortable approving this after Heritage has looked at it and approved it.
I've already filed it with them, so
Yeah.
if that's what you want to do.
I mean, the rest of the commission can weigh in on that, but
No, I think it's a sensible caution.
You get the results, right?
I think in this case you could, because their mapped habitat, you know what, let me just look. I don't know if it's gonna make a difference to you, but the limit of the mapping, sometimes I should print everything.
Is it essential this gets approved? Do you mind waiting until we?
Well, we can't do the work until they sign off anyway.
Yeah,
the only thing that would make a difference is that, you know, your meetings then might be a couple weeks, you know, it might not time. So if we could at least have a quick discussion about, you know, how much of a difference it may or may not make. But yeah, so right, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, so that's fair. I think that makes sense.
Okay.
But I have sent the complete application into them.
Okay.
About a week, same time I did this one.
Okay.
So we'll just continue this maybe for 2 weeks if I could, and then
Just one question.
see where we're at. Yeah, sure.
Is the current approved maintenance access going to be then closed? Or is that
Yes, it would no longer be used.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's a trade.
Yeah.
So we will continue this until March 18th.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so are we hearing these together, Jeff? Or one at a time? Okay. So Hulbert Ack LLC at 2 Hulbert Avenue. Oh, they're the same file number too.
Thank you for the applicant, Paul Santos with Nantucket Surveyors. The applicant being the property owner, Hulbert ACK LLC. Property is located at 2 Hulbert Avenue. It is a active site which is being constructed under an order of conditions that was issued by the commission, SE 483142. And I'm before you with a minor modification request, two minor modification requests, but this is the first one. First one is for the placement of a subsurface underground propane tank. The application says within the buffer zone to a bordering vegetated wetland and with land subject to coastal storm flowage. I've been informed just before the meeting tonight that they're actually not going to put the tank here. We're going to move it out to the front of the property, which is actually outside of the 100-foot buffer zone. So the applicant is proposing to place a buried propane tank within land subject to coastal storm flowage only. This was within the buffer zone to a bordering vegetated wetland that is located to the west of the subject property. So the application is minor mod, buried propane tank. We do already have a waiver in place for groundwater separation. We'll be placing the tank up in the southern portion of the property, as I said, outside the 100-foot buffer, but within land subject to coastal storm flowage. And I'll revise the plan accordingly.
How close to groundwater will this be? Is it in the groundwater?
It'll be in the groundwater. I mean, because typically what they'll do is they'll excavate to groundwater. They'll put a concrete pad in and then anchor it, and they'll anchor it down to keep it from for buoyancy purposes, which is typically what they do in this particular area.
Any other questions?
Actually, you know what? Actually, I actually don't even need the waiver for separation of groundwater because it's not within the 100-foot buffer zone now. It's in land subject to coastal storm flowage.
Because you're moving it because there's a minor mod to the minor mod.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And technically, subsurface tanks are not considered structures by the regulations.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like septic tanks and those things.
Yeah.
Don't require that waiver generally.
So.
Okay, so are there any questions from the commission? Okay, is there a motion to approve the minor mod?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Oh.
Oops.
Oh,
Aye.
Topham,
Topham, aye.
Golding eye.
Arisman, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelberg, aye.
Beal, aye.
That passes unanimously. Voice voting's
Keep
gonna
that one the same plan
get me.
for the next one.
All right, so Hulbert Act LLC at 2 Hulbert Avenue.
Yes, thank you again for the applicant, Paul Santos with Nantucket Surveyors. This is a second minor modification request for the same subject property. Within this application, the applicant is seeking to plant a raised planting configuration on the westerly property line between this property and number 6 Hulbert Avenue, in which they would be raising a raised planting bed and planting, for screening purposes, English oak trees along that property line. It's depicted on the plan in this area here. It's shown as a proposed raised planter box with English oak trees. The intent would be to get the trees up a little bit off of the existing, out of the existing ground, and put a bluestone edging border around a raised planting bed. The reason I asked for this as a second minor modification request is because this is occurring within an area that's already disturbed on the site. There's an existing boardwalk here that's going to be removed. There's an existing fence that will stay in place, but this was an existing developed area of the site prior to this construction happening. But it does occur within the 25-foot no disturb area. The trees themselves, we've just labeled it English oak, but it's a hybrid swamp white oak, very tall tree that provides screening. It's similar. We planted these, or Ben planted these over at Mariner's Way, in between the two properties at Mariner's Way, and that's what we'd be proposing in this particular case. They're 4 feet on center. It's not a year-round screening. It's not an evergreen. It's, like I said, it's an English oak, and I think it's sometimes referred to as a hybrid swamp white oak. And we've listed, obviously this structure has been lifted. We're lifting 6, and they're just looking to provide some screening between the two properties.
Thank you.
Yeah, because an English oak is not a wetland tree by any.
It's a non-native hybrid cultivar as well.
Yeah, I think it's a hybrid swamp white oak is the way it's labeled. I mean, they did offer some other options too, but again, there was no.
I mean, I think my feeling is the planter box seems structural to me. And we are pretty consistent with not allowing non-native plants within the 50 even. So there are my 2 reasons.
Yeah, there are plenty of.
This is Topham. I agree with Ashley's points.
There are plenty of native oak trees that exist here to do the same thing. White oak, red oak, dwarf chickabid, pick one, and you put it in.
That's why I asked for a second.
Yeah.
So from what I'm hearing is that you're not opposed to the plantings, it's the raised planter, the configuration of the bluestone. But the plantings, I'm assuming it's just coming up with a plant that's
Native.
the commission feels native.
Native and not a cultivar.
Okay.
So do you want to continue?
Yeah,
this?
we can continue.
Yes, yeah.
So let's continue, and we'll come back at the next meeting with a different proposal.
Okay, so
All right.
you'll continue until March 18th?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, so we're moving right into orders of conditions.
Sorry, Maureen and Joe, I didn't email you anything, so. You guys can take a snooze.
We trust you guys.
Back to the slope, Joe.
No, they've got to stay on
He's
for
gonna
our
stay.
later stuff. They
Oh,
just,
sorry.
you can read a book or something for a little bit.
No cocktails though, Joe.
Yeah.
Water and hydrating.
Good luck with that one.
So we will start with Nantucket Island School of Design and the Arts Incorporated at 23 and 25 Walwinet Road.
This was the NISDA project that you guys closed last time.
Yes.
And this was for the kind of wetland replication project, drainage project, foundation drain, driveway relocation. Sorry. I know our connection must be on dial-up right now. So we have some invasive things that are there, in case things come in. We have condition 24, which is for the on-site meeting with contractor commission staff, design engineer, representative, and the property owner prior to the start of construction. 25 goes with that. We're going to inspect any mitigation areas prior to any plantings just to review soil conditions. And then 26 was one that we included for the culvert that crosses Walwinet Road to have an on-site meeting with the Department of Public Works, commission staff, and the applicant to go over that work and maintenance to be sure that, one, it's not lost again, and two, what the long-term plan for maintenance of that culvert connection is.
And just one thing related to that, I don't know if it needs a separate condition or not, but we had asked them to remove the autumn olives blocking the culvert access so that it can be maintained better in the future.
Seth, apparently your mic is not working. So you may just turn the one that's on the table around. That one is.
Do I need to repeat that, or did everybody hear it?
No, repeat it for.
Okay, so we had talked about adding a condition to have them remove the autumn olives that are blocking the culvert so that they can access it better for maintenance issues.
So one way is to add a condition 27 that says the autumn olive in the area of the culvert shall be removed.
So what was conditions 26 then?
26 is the one that's as drafted. That's the on-site meeting for the DPW and commission staff.
Thank you. Okay.
And I'll put that autumn olive as a plural in parentheses, just in case when they tear the first one out, if there's, like autumn olive likes to do, have a lingerer or two. I'm kind of looking forward to seeing how this turns out.
So move to approve as amended.
Is there a second?
Second.
Can we stop the voice voting if they're not participating in this part?
Sure.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that carries unanimously with the commissioners present.
She's ruthless.
I know. Time saver. So moving on to 10, did we do that? Yep, 10 Easy Street Nominee Trust at 10 Easy Street.
This was for the 2 parking spaces on that lot at 10 Easy Street.
Move to approve as drafted.
Yeah, is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
So that carries unanimously with the present commissioners. Then moving on to Escape Hatch LLC at 20 Western Avenue.
So this was the one, we had some suggestions, last time to include, some photo monitoring. I kind of kept some conditions from further down the road with any trees that are damaged that are there. We've talked about, and then that condition 23, that a pre-construction meeting with commission staff shall occur to determine the final location of the walking path in the field. You know, there was some concern about where that was going to go, that we would just simply walk with them and hang flags as we went, and then go over methodologies for how they were going to do it, and then try to make the disturbance as possible.
Yeah, because I just hate, like, when you look at the aerials, you can see on the path next door to that just how wide they get over time to try and minimize that.
In terms of condition 20 with the photo monitoring, does that include the survivability metrics that we've been
Yeah,
using?
I mean, we kind of use the photos for that. I mean, we could certainly include a separate survivability condition. We could put a, sorry, I just added, so we could add a condition 24. Get my computer to work. That all replanted areas shall maintain a 90% survivorship or better.
And then one other thing related to vegetation in condition 22, when it talks about the eastern red cedar, do we need to condition the minimum size for replacement, or do we not do that?
We haven't typically done that.
Okay.
I don't think it's going to happen in this case, but like to have it in per chance that something comes up that one needs to go, or something happens, that we're at least prepared.
Okay.
Or maybe they replace like a damaging pine tree with a beautiful red cedar.
That would be the hopes. That's a condition that we took from 34 and 36, where they had some of the black pine that were out there.
Yeah.
They were replacing. I don't recall any there, but I think if there's one in the area of the septic work and it happens to be black pine and we didn't pick it up on the initial survey or something, that if it were happen to go away and get replaced with the red cedar, everyone would be happy with it.
Right. And given how invasive that species is, if it's on adjacent properties, it's likely to spread.
Better than average chance that will eventually show up.
All right, so is there a motion to approve as amended?
I'll move for approval as amended.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And any opposed? All right, so that passes unanimously with our present commissioners. Thank you. And moving on to Summerwind Investments LLC at 14 Celtic Drive.
This is for the garage on Celtic Drive.
Yeah, with 8 parking spots. It blows my mind.
Pretty astonishing.
Yeah, they're gonna cram a lot of people into that little garage apartment.
Well, the parking spaces also service the existing dwelling as well. So, but I would agree, 8 parking spots for a one dwelling. Is a
Well,
lot of
there's
parking spaces.
2 existing, 2 in the garage, and
It's a
4
duplex
more.
treasury, you're
Yeah.
required
Yeah.
under the planning board rules to provide that kind of parking.
See,
Yeah, there you go.
that's why we have Stephen here.
Yeah. All right.
Do we need to worry about oil leaks?
I mean,
Not much we can do about it.
no. All right, I didn't see
I couldn't
anything
really
with
think
this.
of any conditions. Seemed pretty
Yeah.
straightforward.
Right.
Move to approve as drafted.
Is there a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that passes unanimously with our present commissioners. Then moving on to 51 Ocean Avenue
Got some
Nominee
paperwork
Trust at 51 Ocean Ave.
Paperwork?
Oh. This was for the platform on the existing set of stairs outside of the buffer zone for the coastal dune.
So this is the one where the
Yes.
stabilization of the
think
slope needs
19.
addressing.
The erosion blanket.
Why don't we put all disturbed soils shall be revegetated with American beachgrass plugs and the proposed seed mix, and covered with erosion blankets until the soil is stable. That's a bad spelling.
Move to approve as amended with condition 19.
Is there a second?
Yep.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously with our present commissioners. Alright, so then we have an extension request for the Nantucket Pond Coalition, Eastern Shore of Hummock Pond.
So this was for frag work on the eastern shore of Hummock Pond that's been started and is still ongoing. They would like to extend, so they still have the ability to kind of complete their treatment cycle and do any other monitoring or planting or whatever is necessary. So they requested that full 3-year extension, so they have that whole time to make sure that their monitoring is complete and done, and that project is to a point where they either have to permit something new or it's been completed.
Sure.
Is there a second?
Are we all part of this now, again?
What do you mean?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I believe you are,
Yeah, you
yes. Okay. So,
Is there, do you guys have questions, or would you like to second?
Maureen, Phillips, I'll second.
okay.
There we go. So by voice vote, Phillips,
Aye.
Topham,
Aye.
Golding eye.
Arisman, aye.
Flora, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Beal, aye.
All right, that passes unanimously. So moving on to approval of minutes for February 5th and February 19th. I did notice a typo in the February 5th minutes.
Okay.
So on page 5 of 6, it says that I made a statement, and it was actually Seth that made the statement, and in the blurb it says he, so it was just a mistake on the names.
No problem.
Thanks for catching that change.
I mean, it was like a minor miracle that I did, but yeah.
I'm impressed.
Any other thoughts on the minutes? Okay. So should we approve them separately since one needs to be amended? Or can we approve them together?
No, I think you could approve them together with the February 5th minutes as amended.
Okay.
Okay.
Is there a motion?
There is.
Is there a second?
Second.
By voice vote, Phillips,
Aye.
Topham,
Aye.
Golding eye.
Arisman, aye.
Flora, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Beal, aye.
All right, so that passes unanimously. And thank you, Terry, for the minutes.
It's amazing that it's like the first correction in weeks and
And
weeks and
forever,
weeks.
yeah.
Yeah. Which is pretty solid.
And she wasn't here, so.
No. Yeah, she hurt her hand and has been out.
Yeah.
She potentially, yes. But she'll hopefully be back soon. I saw her today and should go in tomorrow and watch the tape and struggle through to make it happen. And
She's a rock
she'll
star.
get them back to us in like 2 days.
Yeah.
Be off and rolling.
We're so lucky to have her. So moving on to monitoring report, Nantucket Conservation Foundation, Medui Creek, and 5 Quays Pasture Road. And then also Pocomo Road Nominee Trust at 72 Pocomo Road.
So again, we just include those in the packet if people have questions or concerns or would like to see someone we can certainly arrange for that, or if you guys were satisfied with the reports, we can just kind of carry on with the agenda. But we try to, like we always say, get people recognition for getting the reports in and on time and get them on the agenda, so at least people know they were good.
Yeah, the NCF stuff coming out of Medina Creek, really interesting.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, so then we will move on to discussion item to discuss SE 482824, which is the SBPF daily logs and chemical analysis report.
So I'm sure they're coming up. When you hear the tone on the phone, that'll be Greg Berman calling in. We're letting him know to call in now. That's why we had to use the conference line for a couple. So he'll also be available for questions and those things too. But if you guys want to come up, and certainly go. And just to warn everyone, I may have to sneak downstairs for like 2 minutes, and then I'll be right back up. But I don't think I'm necessarily needed for all of this for 2 seconds to make sure we get a gift accepted by the select board downstairs. It's usually pretty fast.
Yeah.
Hi, Stephen Cohen for the applicant. Is everybody on? Or are we waiting for?
No, all the commissioners are on.
Okay.
Greg will.
So just make sure you're fairly close to the mics when you're talking.
Sure. Okay. So I think what we have here is a situation that hopefully can be addressed tonight, and hopefully in a very simple manner. So I will try to say that very simply, and then other people will say it in a much more complicated way that I am not capable of doing or qualified to do. But basically, the sand down there has been tested, and it's been tested by the type of people who are recommended in the Berman report to do the testing, and it has also been followed up by hazard mitigation experts to determine whether and how anything should be done because of that. And in just the plain, simplest English, there's nothing wrong with the sand that needs to be addressed, and there's nothing that is recommended for that. And the people who both do that testing and do these plans are prepared to explain why. What I'd like the commission to do, hopefully, is agree with that, and then also approve the sand be continued in the normal process of being used in the template and pushed over and contributed to the littoral system. And the reason why what I want to bring to the commission's attention is outside of this narrow issue, we're now getting into the situation where the storm season is coming to an end, and if the sand is not, if we stop adding sand to the template, and if we stop covering the geotubes, not only we're not contributing to the system during the storm season, which I think is obviously very important to both protecting the bags, but also for to prevent sand deprivation and sand starvation, updrift and downdrift. So we really want to make sure that we're not holding up the sand contributions over something that is not actually a public health or environmental situation, which we don't think it is. Secondly, is if we, outside of missing the storm season, which is the best time for that sand to be down on the template to protect the bags and also to be contributed to the system, if we delay it, then we're running into the situation where people will be returning when the sand is contributed, which I know is not an environmental issue, but is certainly a community issue that we want to try to avoid having all these trucks at the time when people are there, which I don't think any of you want to be responsible for unless there was a good reason for it. Okay, and I know that if there was a good reason for it.
Let's hurry to the wetland issues here.
Okay, well, I think the biggest wetland issue is that we want to have sand on the system contributed during the best time, and the best time is now. So we want to make sure that we've addressed the commission's concerns over any public health or environmental situation so that you can feel comfortable that sand going down there is being contributed at the best time, which is right now. And so I'm going to let the experts explain to you why there's no public health or environmental situation with the sand, but that getting that sand back into the system is what's important.
Real quickly before you start.
Sure.
Good evening, Greg. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing all right. I just wanted to make sure. I thought I heard the phone ding that you were on. So Greg Berman is on the line if you guys have questions on his report, and I'm sure we'll get to you momentarily, Greg.
Yep, not a problem. I'm here.
Great. Good evening. Dwight Dunk with Epsilon Associates. And joining us this evening is also Denise Metzko, a risk assessor and certified toxicologist. So just following up briefly on what Stephen mentioned, we provided the letter last week, which I'm sure you have in your packet, so I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail, but getting to the wetland issues in the interest of the act, the interest of the bylaw. This request for testing of the sand that was placed on the template came about in December when there was a discussion about how best to deal with the man-made debris that's in the sand, the bricks and stuff like that that's in the sand. And there was a discussion about pushing it over with aggressive monitoring to remove that material. The commission seemed open to that discussion, that approach of removing that type of debris, but wanted the testing to determine if there's any contamination in the sand. The report that was submitted by OHI that we discussed 2 weeks ago demonstrated that the sand is not contaminated. It doesn't contain chemical contamination or metal contamination. That was prepared by an LSP, as identified by Mr. Berman, suggesting that LSPs be involved. The nutrients that were identified in the sand, we've addressed that back in December when I had commented about the testing and including nutrients that with the fate and the transport of this to the open ocean does not lead to environmental issues in the receiving waters. That's reiterated in this letter dated February 28. It's an open ocean situation, well-mixed waters. Number one, it's phosphorus doesn't lead to increased primary productivity because it's a nitrogen-limited system. The nitrogen, if it was of a concern, it's a well-mixed system such that we don't have issues of low DO that would be caused by an algal bloom in those materials settling out into the deep waters, the bottom waters, and leading to a DO, as I discussed. The issue that was of discussion 2 weeks ago then was also about the presence of total coliform. So we've asked a risk assessor to provide a risk review in terms of the public health issues with that. In terms of environmental health, ecological, these are naturally occurring soil bacteria, as we discussed. And so in terms of the environment, it's not introducing anything to the environment that isn't there. So I'd like to just have Denise provide a quick review. In the letter, you saw that there was identified to be no significant human health risk of the total coliform in the sand, and I'll let Denise provide an overview, and then we're open to questions.
My name is Denise Mezzo. Okay, thank you. I'm with Collaborative Risk Solutions. As Dwight mentioned, I am a board-certified toxicologist. I'm also a human health risk assessor. I have a degree in public health, and typically the work that I do, I work with a number of the most work that I do is in Massachusetts at sites that are under the MCP regulations. And if you're not familiar with those are hazardous waste regulations, and I work with licensed site professionals or LSPs. And I was asked to review the information as well as Mr. Berman's letter of February 18th with respect to the potential for human health risks. So typically in a project, I would identify the contaminants that may be of concern, a risk driver, what the risks are, and then what levels they would need to be reduced to in order to meet a level of no significant risk. The typical types of constituents that I look at would be, say, the metals, and actually a lot of the other chemicals that were evaluated by OHI. But in this case, they're not necessary because those are present. They've already been demonstrated to be present at low concentrations. So I review the information, and based on my evaluation, looking at total coliform are actually not considered to be pathogenic or of concern for public health in terms of soil exposures or environmental exposures, and that's sort of across the board. Certainly total coliform is used in terms of evaluating potential risks in terms of drinking water, identifying breaches in drinking water systems. They may be used as a screening tool for food as well. And so I looked first at the sort of toxicological information, of which there is little, unfortunately, on total coliform. Unlike a number of the other constituents, we don't have a safe level demonstrated for coliform because total coliform is not considered dangerous per se. An evaluation of exposure, so risk assessment as it's evaluated under Mass DEP, and it's typical standard of practice across other regulatory agencies. We have various components that go into it. There's the hazard identification, which is identifying constituents that are present above. Typically in Massachusetts, we look at above background conditions is number one. And then we look at the potential for human health effects. In this case, it is somewhat unclear. Mr. Berman noted that there's potentially some impacts from the environment that could be naturally occurring, or it could be fecal contamination from wildlife, or domestic animals. There's other potential sources, or it could be from the gray sand, which again, I would agree with Mr. Berman that it appears the gray sand concentrations are higher than the tan sand, I think is what it was called. And so part one is sort of hazard identification. Based on my review, there's no hazard identified. That said, if we move on beyond that, and we assume that there is potential for hazard, because there is the potential for a subclass of bacteria to be pathogenic in a total coliform sample, we then look at the potential for exposure. And we also look at dose response information. And dose response information is basically quantifying how toxic something may be. There is no dose response information available for total coliform, so that's not very helpful for us. However, we do have, typically when we look at exposure, we can quantify exposures, and that's based on the potential pathways for human health contact. I was able to visit the viewing area today for the project, so I have definitely a better understanding of not only what it looks like and the potential for the transport. In this case, I'm not a fate and transport expert, by the way, but at least that was helpful. I did see deer tracks, which indicate that there is wildlife there. And I did not see any human activity, in early March on the beach, but the potential for contact would be most likely dermal, somebody contacting the sand. And with coliform, with pathogenic bacteria, the typical concern would be ingestion. So that would be contaminated food, for example, or contaminated drinking water. Contaminated sand is not typically identified as a public health concern. There are times where it could be, and that's typically related to massive gull fecal inputs, which there are not in the Northeast that I know of that have been identified, but on the West Coast there are places where there is some concern. I did not note that here, and I don't believe that, come summertime, that's a concern here. And so there's limited potential for human contact. This is not discharging into a drinking water body, for example. And we also don't have any basis for believing that this is septic sludge, this gray sand. And that's based on, not based on visual observation, but based on an understanding. And frankly, the total coliform counts, which are lower than what's typically reported for a sludge material. So, Mr. Berman also noted some methods that may be used to provide, say, a more hostile environment for bacteria in general. So rather than, gray sand that was sampled, at depth where it's more moist, that, if it was at the surface and exposed to UV as well as, wind and dried out, that could reduce the coliform content. And that may be the case. I think there's also probably additional load from the environment and wildlife anyway, but I certainly wouldn't be opposed to that. I don't particularly see the need for that from a human health risk protection perspective. So there's no need for remediation in this case. And the existing conditions meet this condition of not a significant risk level for public health. And I wanted to just also let Mr. Berman, I'm also open obviously to questions at the end of this as well.
Just in closing, before we kind of open up for comments from Mr. Berman or others, we generally agree with Mr. Berman's comments in his letter and his summary and conclusions that the total coliform bacteria in a hostile environment will die off relatively quickly in dry, coarse sand, as well as UV exposure, and then once it gets down into a salt environment. Using the sand as intended in terms of pushing it off the top of the template onto the side slopes so that it's available to be contributed to the littoral system. In doing that, when it's on the side slope, it's also in a loose condition so that it's therefore able to dry out and desiccate more quickly, and it sits there for a while. And then as it gets sloughed off and further onto the beach, it continues to have that UV exposure and then salt exposure. And so with that, in terms of over time, those total bacterial counts would degrade over time and then be killed off. So we agree with Mr. Berman's comments on that. And with that, we, as Stephen mentioned, we would like to pursue what we had discussed back in December about using the sand as intended for the sand to contribute to the littoral system, so that we are maintaining that with the rigorous monitoring while it's being pushed over to remove material and debris, so that the bricks and that type of debris that may be that was observed, it has been picked out of the template right now, where there hasn't been moving any. We really haven't been picking any up lately, so that we can make sure that material doesn't wash out onto the beach. So that's what we'd like to do. We also identified two other things in the letter that I don't know if we can get to clarification on tonight. The lot just to the south of the sand ramp, 85 Baxter Road, where there had been a house that had been demolished and removed. We've talked about this before, that there is building materials that are sticking out of the bluff as the bluff erodes back, pipe, conduits, footings, bricks. We'd like to have permission to remove that material from the bluff, cutting it off so it's not continuing to be a source, so that we can get that debris off. And then the Pulpus Harbor sand has been purchased for use on the template. The testing that we were able to identify was that was tested in the harbor before the dredging. It had very low silt concentrations. It was all sand. The DEP did not have any chemical testing required per 314 CMR 9, so that, you know, the sand being below 10% and due diligence that there hasn't been spills and, you know, contamination in Pulpus Harbor suggests that it's clean sand, so it follows the beach nourishment guidelines. So we just wanted to get, you know, acceptance of that material to be put onto the template when we can start, when we get authorization to start replacing sand onto the template.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. So I just want to start by saying, or maybe correcting, Steve Cohen's statement, because he said numerous times there's nothing wrong with the sand. Maybe there's not a human health risk, but it's not clean, compatible fill as part of the permit. So that's, you know, somewhat of a misleading statement there.
And we have not disagreed with that. We're here in December. We talked about it in December, and in terms of the grain size, the grain size was fine, but we understand that there's the debris, so we're looking for a way to remove that debris. Right. And we had talked about that in December.
Yeah. Questions from the commission, either for SBPF or Mr. Berman, who's on the phone?
You know, I mean, when you say that it can't be proved, or correct me if I'm wrong, that you feel that the gray sand wasn't contaminated by septic systems being, but in fact, you can't. You say that scientifically. So you know, it's an either or. You can't say it was or it wasn't. And, you know, when you talk about the deer prints, I guess I'm sort of, you know, I've listened to these rationalizations that really are beginning to irritate me. But that's my personal feelings. And as a member of the commission, you know, who am I to contradict an expert? So, Greg, is it worthwhile with making any comment on that?
So, most of my experience is as a coastal geologist, and I have spent time as an environmental scientist many years ago in different states. That's why it was very gratifying to have a toxicologist and the LSPs kind of weigh into this project. But I am not comfortable saying whether it's from a human source or an animal source, just based on total coliforms.
Right.
I don't know that that's necessarily, I don't know how to phrase it, a deal breaker for this particular project. If the coliforms are coming from either one of those sources, I'm betting they're going to mobilize pretty quickly in this environment and die out pretty quickly. Obviously much better this time of year than in the summer. But yeah, like you said, I don't have the experience to say it's from a human or animal source.
Right.
I comment on that, Greg. I understand what you're saying, and I think what I'm hearing is the total coliform. The coliform are naturally occurring bacteria, whether it's from a topsoil or some other source. The hostile environment is going to cause it to die off regardless of its source. And then when, you know, in terms of it being in the ocean, then it will be gone when it gets into the open ocean. It's shown that there's none on the intertidal, and I think that's because of I think as Greg mentioned, and you know, through the die-off and, you know, just and loss. So I think the trying to determine the source is kind of chasing an unanswerable question. The fact is what's going to happen to it in the environment, and I think we're on the same page with Mr. Berman that it's going to die off. And I think, you know, we've identified that you know, the human health risk isn't there in its current counts, and in the future, as it degrades, it becomes even less of a risk as it's lower counts.
So I have a question regarding the coliform. We had talked last time about essentially when you have the total coliform count that you can extrapolate the percentage that might be fecal coliform, which is what you'd be more concerned about for human health. So if we had actual measurements of the fecal coliform, are there then set standards? So
That's
there
the
aren't for that
problem.
either. Okay.
So the right, so the fecal coliform are a subset,
right,
and then typically, you look at even a subset of the fecal when you start thinking about human health. Okay. Often it's the E. coli that is what one would target. So for food contamination, that's something that one would target. And the reason people look at total is they say, it's a screen, and for drinking water, you use that screen, and then you could jump to fecal, but often you might jump to E. coli because that's really what kind of getting more to what the concern is. So it is a challenge. It is a challenge that we don't have readily available standards, especially in soil. It's just not seen. The challenge of total coliform especially is that it's on plants, in the soil. It's sort of.
So that's why I was kind of wondering, I guess, if we should go back in and soil test specifically to get the fecal coliform, the numbers that actually impact human health. And I know that was discussed a little bit last time, but I think that might be valuable in this case.
Yeah, I was going to say that following up on what Denise said with the total coliform, in terms of the typical issues here are drinking water supplies or where it's otherwise consumed, and with that being the largest group of those species, that's why they're tested for, because they're larger number of species, larger counts.
It's also indicative of environmental contamination.
Right. So a break within a well or
break
something
in a
like
well, which could be completely unrelated to any animal waste, but it could be a substrate.
But I'm sorry.
That's why.
Right. So, unless we find Scott toilet tissue paper in the damn sample, I mean, we're going to be just going around and around. And even if we find, if we ask for another round of testing and we find that it's clearly human fecal coliform, it's not going to get us anywhere, because you're saying that it's going to degrade when it's exposed to sunlight. And so I just feel we've sort of reached a dead end on this subject. I mean,
I infer from what you said earlier that if it degrades over time, and it's been a long time now that suspect sand was dumped there, that because it degrades, it's okay to keep dumping it.
No, we're not saying to keep dumping it. We've, as we said last time.
I mean, finding used septic sand, dumping it because it'll degrade over time.
No, we're not proposing that. We
thank goodness.
Identified that that source is not going to be used. We proposed back in December a revised protocols, which call for the typical testing for grain size, but also due diligence of sites to determine if there's been any spills, if it's a site that has chemical contamination.
I was just troubled by your comment that
we are not.
It goes away, so it's okay to use it.
No, we're not proposing to use anything like that. Again, we acknowledge that there was certainly an error made in using that material.
Thank you.
But what I'm saying is, as it is on there and gets pushed over, for this one-time slug, but no.
So Denise, I'll direct this one to you. So if theoretically we were going to go and take additional sampling for fecal coliform or even for E. coli specifically in the template, and then in control locations located to the north and south of the template along the beach and bluff, would that tell us anything meaningful about trying to analyze what the existing conditions of the surrounding area versus the site? Or
Great question. Yeah. I mean, that's so often the first step in this hazard identification is understanding conditions relative to background. Again, unfortunately, Mass DEP provides a lot of data for natural and other anthropogenic background concentrations in soil for metals, for example. There's no data for total coliform. So again, fecal coliform. So doing that type of sampling would provide, and say if you went to the north and south, it would provide an understanding of the concentrations here, relative to concentrations where you don't have, any potential impacts of the gray sand. I would, yes, it would do that. There's other, whether it's grain size or moisture, there's other pieces that would impact the concentrations that you would find, right? It's not as simple as sometimes geological types of measurements, but certainly that would what it would enable is to say, hey, is this no different? Obviously no different from anywhere else, or hey, is it quite different? If it is different, you still have a challenge because you don't have a health-based standard to compare it against. But it would provide information relative to what is typical, right? So.
And one point to your question, Seth, is you mentioned E. coli. In terms of testing for that in soil or sand soil, there are no labs around here that do that. It gets tested in water because that's the medium in which it is generally identified as the exposure pathway for human health. So where eating soil and sand is typically not a significant exposure pathway, it's not something that there's no lab testing around here for that.
So I have another question, which is really for Greg, because 2 weeks ago we were discussing some of the commissioners wanted the sand to be removed. In your opinion, is there any scientific basis to justify removing the sand at this point?
So for this sand, one thing about this sand, if you were going to do another round of testing in another couple of months and saw that the concentrations were not reducing, you may want to think about removal. If you can do another round and show that it's actually reducing, and by all reasonable expectations, it should be reducing in a sandy environment, in this coastal kind of degradation, it should be reducing pretty quickly. If that's the case, one would think that it's going to continue doing that, and certainly if we have any kind of activity, storm activity in March and April, it's certainly going to stir things up pretty quickly. And this isn't something that you would encourage. It's not great to get rid of this kind of contamination by putting it in a coastal system, but with respect to what's currently here, I don't think it would do too much additional damage to what's already there, and especially if you do that testing to show that it has produced. You can look to background, see if it actually give a little more evidence to see if it was coming from this source, which seems likely from this indication. But if the background shows significant total coliforms, it may come from a different source. But as of right now, it's very likely going to degrade very quickly. Potentially after a big storm, it's not going to be there at all. But I mean, there's no 100% guarantees, but I would think that would be a fairly rational argument to kind of allow nature to get rid of it.
Thank you.
This is Maureen Phillips. What it sounds like to me is, because we are struggling with this because this is a unique situation. Other beaches, it's not tested at other beaches. Other beaches aren't having new material dumped on it on a relatively, on a frequent basis. And, excuse me, and yes, it does sound like this environment will degrade it, as Greg mentioned. That's kind of too bad that this is where you put contaminated stuff to degrade, but at this point in time, it does look like this environment would do it. But with what Greg was just saying about testing again, to see if these concentrations, go down as one would expect because of the environment or not. I think that would be very important to do because we are in a unique environment. It's not the usual, super fun site or anything like that. But we are dealing with an area where, people and children, will be, rolling around in what is there on the beach. And I think that is, our mission is to make sure this resource area is kept pristine. And so I don't think we have, despite all the information we have so far, I don't think we have exactly the kind of information we need to determine that, what is there is in fact going to degrade, quickly enough. And also, Greg, you had mentioned that you suggested that maybe other samples could be collected and analyzed, farther away from the geotubes to get a background level. I mean, that strikes me also as something, to be done. There is no standard, there isn't a statutory standard for this area. I think we as the Conservation Commission have to establish, a standard which makes us feel comfortable that we are in fact discharging our duty to keep these resource areas pristine and usable for everyone on Nantucket, both residents and visitors. And I think we need to do second test, additional testing. I think we need to do get a background level from other areas, from what I've read through all the various expert reports. And excuse me. And I also think, and it does sound like the SBPF and its representatives agree that, and we did discuss this at a prior meeting where I was present, that we have, more robust testing of the sand material before it gets dumped over the side to make sure it is, the proper size and in a much more detailed way than was done earlier. So, because I think that I just the idea of saying that it's all taken care of because of that environment, kind of, whatever so far has come down over the side of the bluff. I don't like to leave it that's going to take care of any contamination problems. I want to see further testing, and I want to see background testing as well.
Thank you, Maureen.
Just one thing I would add to that, if I can. Just if additional testing is done for this, you certainly wouldn't need the full suite of potential contaminants like pHs, metals, that sort of thing could be left off the further rounds of testing just because they showed clean already.
Right, we'd be looking at the nutrients and coliform.
Yeah, I was assuming we would do, focus on the TC and, that's clearly what we're worried about. We're not worried about arsenic or, any other heavy metal issue.
The thing is, Maureen, I mean, that in Greg's report, when he's talking about the mean versus the maximum values of the TC in the beach samples, I correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but you say that the maximum values of the suspect sand and the beach samples are very similar. This suggests that the high values in the beach may have come from the suspect sand. But for the mean, it seems to have degraded fairly quickly. So I'm just wondering where this is going to take us going forward. While in the final analysis, and believe you me, I don't accept any money from SBPF, but the whole point is to protect, the the bluff from erosion while they've got the geotubes there, and to have enough sand to deal with a possible storm next month. So,
I
do
guess.
you? Well, I'm sorry, Greg. That was sort of a mumbled question. You know, do you do you have anything to add there?
So, no, I mean, it's very reasonable thought process. And I guess one thing I would say is when you're looking at the max versus the mean, as you know, like, if you happen to hit a hot spot, you're going to get a high max. But if you do a lot of samples, it's going to average out to a lower concentration value. So I think that may be what we have here is either we happen to get a hot spot or we got a lot of samples that weren't as high as the rest of the suspect material. So that's just one reason why if you just look at the mean, it might, or it does indicate that the suspect sand is actually lower. But when you look at the max, they're pretty closely tied together between the suspect and the stuff on the beach. So usually you don't get contamination from the beach going up on the template, so that's the rationale for why it was a little more likely that coming from the template looking at the max values.
Right, but so when you have the mean, you say the typical sand template is 19 mpn per gram, and the suspect sand template is 263. So that's what 15 times the value. So it's obviously much higher. But from what I'm hearing is that it's going to degrade. That you can't say that that's actually a threat to human health anyway, and that it's going to degrade fairly quickly.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I mean, the main thing looking at the mean is that the stuff on the beach is actually even higher than the suspect. So that kind of was a little bit of a red herring. But the suspect sand is, higher concentration than the typical sand also. But it should degrade pretty quickly. I mean, really additional testing is peace of mind to the commission.
So just one question, if I may, Ashley, and that is, so the difference between the suspect template at 263 and between the template and the mean high water was, what, 1 3/4, from 263 to 415? And I wondered whether or not that was because the sand that had come off into the intertidal zone was the sand that was the most contaminated. I mean, is there any other explanation?
It certainly could be. I mean, we're getting a little bit into looking at our crystal balls now.
Yeah,
and the material coming off, if the material coming off of the template is contaminated and going down onto the beach, then I think that means that the beach was sampled in spots that were hotter that may have come off of the template. And the potential suspect areas, there were a few of those that weren't as hot as the beach even. So there's a lot of, how the sampling was undertaken on the ground has a lot to do with this, which is why it's good that they give us, the full range of statistics to be able to get a feel for what's going on. But yeah, I mean, it's in my mind more likely that some of the stuff on the beach came from the suspect sand than another source. But if you also do additional background testing that shows really high values that have nothing to do with the suspect sand, then that just might mean that there's kind of an issue with the beach itself coming from another source. So there's still some areas where it can be unsure. It's just these are kind of the most likely based on the evidence right now.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah.
I appreciate Greg's idea to do another round of testing on the nutrients and coliform, just to say, okay, if you're saying that this is going to naturally degrade, we should already see that in a second round of tests. Like, we shouldn't just assume that that's going to be happening. And then I think we would also need to continue testing until those levels are at background, to say, oh, it took 3 months. Oh no, a year later, we're still dealing with high levels in this area. I also think, speaking to Ian, your last question, we had identified that there's probably a higher silt content in the suspect sand. Right. So during those rainstorms, we've seen pictures of plumes. So that's going to carry a lot of the nutrients and the coliform with it. for, spots on the beach.
Yeah.
In terms of additional testing, I think as Greg mentioned, it's probably more peace of mind. In terms of being effective testing for what is a potential issue, I'd like Greg to determine contribute whether or not he thinks nutrients is needed, because the nutrients going into the system, into this well-mixed system, are not going to have, number one, there's no human health issue relative to the nutrients. Number two, there's no environmental damage by these nutrients going into the system. Greg, I'm assuming you read the letter that we prepared, and I'd like to know your opinion if you think this is a well-mixed system, and therefore the nutrients would or would not affect the water quality of the receiving water.
Yeah, so happy to comment. I'm afraid I don't think I have that letter, but just based on our conversation so far, I would agree it's a well-mixed system. I don't think the nutrients and maybe even total coliforms would have a potential human health impact. But I'm not a LSP. I'm glad you've had conversations with them to kind of indicate the same thing. So I do think once it gets in the water, it's going to go away very quickly. Any additional testing would just be to show that it's getting out of the sand. The comment that there may be more silt in this material. One thing I did see in the testing results was grain size, which I assume that the grain size was compatible. So if it's the same material, it typically goes away quicker. But if there were a lot of silts or even clays in there, it might stick around longer. So, I think you're right. Is the short story that any nutrients or coliforms are probably going to go away quickly, and that's probably not going to have impact on human health. If the commission wants to be able to say for sure, yes, we saw reductions over time and it went away, then additional testing will be needed.
Thank you. Any other questions from the commission before I open it up to the public? All right, so I'm going to open.
I kind of feel that Ian is on the right course, and that I do agree we should do one more round of testing just to see if there is if quantities and contaminants are going down. I think that's great, but I do think that whereas PPF has said that they would mix in the sand and aerate it, I think that then there's kind of a point where once the testing is done that they should be able to do that and kind of move on. I think we're getting to, we're going back around in circles here again.
Okay, so now I'm going to open it up to the public.
Thank you, Burton Balkine. I'd like to first talk about the human health issues and the potential of exposure. I witnessed a classroom of kids walking the base of the template, walking through the mud that was coming off. So to the toxicologist's comment about she didn't notice any human activity, I've seen human activity, like 30 or 40 kids walking through the stuff at the bottom of the template, and also seen another time a family, and I monitor the SBPF Q2 project once a week. I would also like to see the board do another round of coliform and fecal testing. I think it's your duty to make sure that this is dissipating, as Greg Berman and Mr. Dunk have also said. And then and I'd also like to have the board test any new sand, like the Pulpus Harbor dredge sand. I would like to have extensive testing in that, just from the track record of the SBPF and their what's happened in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
RJ Turcotte, Nantucket Land Council. So the whole commission's in agreement. This is contaminated fill across the board. the sampling, the testing that's gone on so far by the independent lab has raised almost more questions than answers. We don't, in fact, know how much of what kind of coliform, what kind of bacteria is in this sand. There are going to continue to be questions. SPPF's not going to be able to continue their work of keeping the template covered. There's one really simple solution that's within your authority as the commission, an enforcement order, just to remove that 4,000 cubic yards. That'll just completely wipe that slate clean. They can start using other material. They can fill it, cover it, and move on. The longer this sits on here, the longer it could be a threat. It could be an issue. And as far as other projects that are also using clean fill, as their permit suggests, this cannot be allowed to be used as mitigation material. It's a bad precedent to set. So there's a really simple solution that could just end it all now. Because right now, it's just really educated guesses as to what is in here, whether it's a threat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Yvonne Valancourt. I had a question. So if you do sample for fecal coliform, or I would go for fecal coliform, but if you're looking to see if the levels change, then you have to sample what they sampled, which is total coliform. So I would do both of those, or I would want to see both of those done as a member of the community. I understand that I agree with RJ. I think the most simple thing is to take it all away. I also see the opportunity to learn from this and to create a protocol. But it seems like a lot of work and a lot of testing and a lot of money either way you go. So if you can just remove it all, that seems kind of like a good plan. But if you go with testing, you definitely can test fecal coliform and total coliform from soil. People do all kinds of extractions of bacteria from soil. So that's possible. But my question was, if you do total coliform again, it would have to, you can't mix it all up and then test it, because it will obviously be less. Period, because you've mixed it all up. The other point is this is a series of samples. It's not that it was understood already that all of this template was a conglomerate. So there are definitely hotspots, I would assume. That's what we're seeing in the discrete data. It's not all from the same source. So some of it, I mean, I'm not going to suggest go and microsample around those areas that had the high levels, but if you were trying to get to those answers, you would. I guess the question is, what are we trying to do here? And if you're trying to just keep the beach clean on an island where it's quite warm this week and everybody's walking, they do it on our beach where I am with their dogs, and the dogs run up and down all of the space. And then you pat your dog and your kid pats your dog and they stick their hands in their mouth before you can get to them. So I think if there's bacteria that shouldn't have been there because it came from somewhere we don't know where, then the best thing to do is to just get rid of it. But if you're trying to find out what it is, then I think testing is good. Just test before they mix it all up. And so that's my question back to you, is how would you then go about testing it?
Yeah, my feeling is if we were going to ask them to repeat test, it would be the template as it is now before they mixed in the same locations to actually prove that the numbers are decreasing as they suggest they should. And not, again, for the whole slew of tests, but for coliform. And my feeling is since the nutrients were above the baseline, it's a contamination that we should be tracking. So that was my thought. I don't know what the rest of the commission was thinking, or if you even want to do that.
I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable to do exactly what Yvonne is suggesting, to test for both types of coliform. I feel that while part of me would like to see it all removed, I'm not sure that we can really justify it from
the point of view of the long-term hazard of retaining it there if it is becoming less threatening to humans. So I'm reluctant to say remove it, because I'm wondering how the hell are they going to remove it? You know, excuse my language. It would seem to me to be it would be difficult to remove. In other words, you're going to have to bring it back up the bluff.
Yeah, nothing's easy about this.
No, and what happens? You know, could they refuse, saying that we didn't have the basis for ordering them to remove it, because the scientific evidence that we've been given by their experts is saying that it's not a threat to human health. So, I mean, I'm just telling you my thought processes. Were you going to say something, Greg, or?
Oh, no,
I
mean, I think you're on the right track there. It's a good thought process. But, I mean, you could bring in your own environmental scientist expert, but I would imagine that they would likely find the same potential human health risk, which is certainly for the nutrients, minimal if anything. Total coliforms would be very difficult. And I don't think you necessarily have to say that if you do more testing, you're guaranteed not to pull it out. Like if you do more testing and find that it's not degrading, always at that point. My best guess is it's been a couple of months. I bet a lot of this is degraded already.
So,
Well, there you have it.
Thank you. This is Maureen again.
Thank you, Eva.
I think that we're kind of crossing several bridges before we have come to them in terms of what would warrant removal and what objections might be made and the rest of it. I personally think that we should, have further testing done along the lines that Yvonne and Ashley were just talking about, and I've mentioned before. I mean, there's little downside to that, and we'll have some more information, and that will. I personally want every bit of peace of mind on this that I could have. This is not something that potential contamination of a beach, those are fighting words on this island, and we need to, I think, make sure that we looked under every grain of sand that we need to, and I don't think it's asking too much by any means to have additional testing done to see if the suppositions that everyone is making on a hopeful basis are in fact true. In case they may well be, and that'll be great. But I don't want to say we're done until we have, that amount of additional testing done. And then we have other issues with the quality of the spill with regard to grain size and other things and all the foreign objects that have been coming out and the rest of it. But vis-a-vis the contamination issue, I think I would move that we require these additional tests. That's where I'm coming from. I feel pretty strongly about that. Thank you.
And I do have to say, this wouldn't be the first time we've asked material from a beach to be removed. It wouldn't necessarily be the sand, but we had that project, the Brock's Cottage, that dumped all that bouldering material over, and we knew it was going to be tough. It still had to go. So, not compatible to me means not compatible.
Right, and it's not part of our brief anyway, but nonetheless,
can
it's
I-
sort of part of it.
Can I direct a question to OHI regarding how long an additional round of sampling would take if we decided to do that?
I think we could have the data back for your next meeting.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, let's go with that then. Isn't that the general?
Two
general.
weeks.
Yeah.
2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll have it for your next meeting.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I still think we have comments for the public on this, Jeff.
sorry.
Do
Yeah.
we need a motion to have them test again?
I think if you finish the comments, if someone made a
Motion
motion
after that.
to do that, I think that would be the way to go.
Okay. Do you still have comment?
RJ Turcott, Nantucket Land Council. So right now, SPPF is removing debris and materials and replacing them in kind with the same volume of clean fill.
They're collecting the materials and assessing the volume. They have not done any sort of replacement.
Right, but at
point.
the end.
Mhm.
So why handle this any differently? It's the same thing. It's not clean fill. It's contaminated. It should just be remove and replace. Handle it the same way as the other half of the enforcement order, and just put an end to it. I mean, if these results come back and whatever coliform, fecal, or whatever ends up being tested for is considered to potentially be a threat again, is everyone just going to wait a little bit longer and see if it's gone down further?
Yeah, I think that probably after a second round of testing, my assumption is we take a vote as a commission, and see, who agrees to push it over and kind of follow their protocol, and potentially have some commissioners say they would want it removed.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Edie Ray, I'd like to sort of circle back for a minute to the beginning of where this whole discussion started, and the fact that SBPF dumped contaminated sand into the project area. And the only reason that you guys or any of us knew about it is through some independent person who happened to be wandering on the beach and monitoring it. That to me is a frightening thing. I'd like to also sort of again circle back to the beginning of this conversation tonight, where Ms. Arisman said, face it, it's non-compatible, not clean fill that they're throwing over the edge. What does it take for there to be a failure of this project, for them to not be in compliance with the rules that have been set down by you guys? What does it take for you all to be able to say, enough, you have not been in compliance and it needs to stop? I'd really like to know what the tipping point, if you will, is for a failure of a project like this.
So typically, and Jeff can weigh in, when a project goes out of compliance per our guidelines, the first step is to try and get it back into compliance. So that's what this process is trying to do, to get the structure back into compliance.
Okay, so that's what we're all working for.
Before, we were only going on grain size.
Right.
So they met that, but now we have to change that. There's more things that have to be considered, and I think we're trying to work it out so that in the future, everything's covered.
So you're not going to be asking for SBPF to be monitoring their own actions in the future? You're going to have some active monitoring from this group to sort of oversee, the hen is not, what is it, the fox is not guarding the hen house?
Well, we've talked to them now. When they go out and do daily inspections, they have to have a named person on those inspection sheets to identify the individual responsible that day for checking the template. They're also responsible for, numerous quarterly reports and surveys. So, it goes both ways.
And with the quarterly reports, I think I understand that those weren't done in compliance with what you guys
but
were.
That unfortunately is not part of our discussion tonight.
Okay, so we can't talk about that.
Yeah, I think that would be better for.
I think if Coastal Conservancy is truly worried about all the beaches, they should be checking every site, not just this one.
I think what Joe means by that is that we have a feeling that there's probably contaminated sand has been used more than just on this site, and going forward we're hoping that we'll be able to draft regulations so that there won't be any contaminated sand in future being used on projects around the island. Is that correct, Joe?
That is perfect, thank you.
And I just want to make it clear that I'm here as me. I'm not representing the Coastal Conservancy or anybody. I'm just a concerned citizen. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think if I could add to Ian and Joe's comment, I think from our staff perspective, one of the things that, we've kind of learned and adjusted to the most is, looking back at some of the older permits, not just for this project, but for others and into other structures, that there's been big jumps in how we've monitored sand. I mean, some of the original nourishment products, compatibility was judged by visual inspection only. So if the sand kind of looked the same by someone's opinion, you were good. And then that evolved into the current DEP nourishment guidelines that are there. And I think what we're all kind of seeing is, especially as sand becomes a more and more readily available material, that criteria isn't enough to properly address all of the concerns that are involved. It's just not as simple as sand and silt and clay content. That looking a little bit deeper sometimes is something that needs to be done. And maybe how we're looking at those things is something that needs to evolve as well. So hopefully at the end of the day, that's kind of what comes commission-wise and policy-wise, is doing a more thorough look, not by anyone's fault, but, seeing now where we're at and correcting that for the future as well.
Thank you, Joe.
I'm losing my voice.
You got to come up here if you have a comment.
I'm just dying.
I appreciate.
So you still have to
Sure.
state your name.
Stephen Cohen. I appreciate the concern. I think we need to be practical here, and removing 4,000 cubic yards of sand is 300 dump trucks, and trying to get that out of there, I think, is a very big undertaking and impactful on the environment. And also delaying the sand being contributed is also impactful on the environment. So we want to try to act as responsibly, but also in consideration of other factors. And so, doing more testing is, I guess, what the commission wants to do apparently, and is fine. But I just want to keep in mind that we shouldn't, lose the forest for the trees.
Yeah. So again, if you just said it's 300 dump trucks or so, it is mind-blowing to me that your contractor dumped 300 dump trucks full of this gray contaminated material. So I think we should place less blame on the commission that's trying to be thorough and protect our resource areas, and look back and say, maybe it's our fault this is happening.
I don't.
So we're trying to be
place any blame on
thorough
the
to protect the resource areas. And if that is 2 weeks on another test, that's 2 weeks on another test.
I think the commission's being prudent here. I didn't dump it there. You didn't dump it there. It's a situation that's unfortunate that needs to be resolved. And I certainly don't think we should resolve it by sweeping it under the rug and ignoring it and not being prudent. Okay, I think that the commission and SPPF needs to be prudent. And that means making sure that appropriate steps are being taken to make sure, A, that there's no environmental or health issue, and B, that we're not getting caught up in an issue that might be much smaller than the actual environmental issue of making sure that there's sand nourishment at the right time and that the bluff is protected at the right time. So we need to, address both issues together. And I don't want to in any way suggest that, you should just give a free ride for something that shouldn't have happened. It definitely shouldn't have happened. And I think that we have since December put into place protocols to make sure that doesn't happen on SBPF site, and I think that the commission is using those to try to make sure it doesn't happen on other sites too. So
just one other question. I believe I heard the commission vote for additional testing.
I don't think we've gone through the vote
Okay,
yet.
okay. Well, if we just want to be clear so that we know what if the commission does vote for that, we'd like to know the constituents. I think I've heard kind of uniformly TC, total coliform and fecal coliform, and there's been back and forth on whether or not nutrients are needed. But if additional testing is needed, I think we agree that total coliform and fecal coliform would make sense.
Okay. I mean, my feeling is I'd still want to see the nutrient levels just because they were above background, and it's not a difficult test to do.
Yeah, I know not everybody is necessarily looking at what I'm looking at, but I'm looking at the location of where samples happened in the first run, which everybody should have in the packets. And because we requested discrete samples, obviously we would need the samples taken at the same coordinates and elevations as done before. But then we also have to discuss the background testing that would happen outside the site. So I think I'll defer to the chair for the process, but I think we need to have a vote on if we want the testing, and then if so, have a discussion on exactly what that would be.
It's also not a relative issue, but the 820 boat is leaving in 20 minutes. If that's a consideration for the board as well, for the people who are trying to make it off island, which is not me, but other people here.
Okay. Well,
Again.
Fair enough. You know, I think we're all agreed that we want additional testing. Greg, do you feel that it would be a help to have the nitrates and the phosphates and the minerals tested as well as fecal and the total coliform, or do you feel that the fecal and total is sufficient? Or would you rather plead the fifth?
It's entirely up to you guys. I mean, the coliforms are probably most concerning, and even that, I mean, human health may not be that big of a concern. The nutrients are above background. They're probably above template. Again, it's probably a relatively cheap and easy thing to show that they're reducing over time.
Okay, thank you.
yeah. And
Okay.
Greg, would you have any suggestions then from how far away from the template we should get background samples for these nutrients and coliform?
I would leave some of the sampling plan to OHI, whatever group is actually doing it, but I wouldn't recommend going both updrift and downdrift, so both directions a decent ways. Just if you happen to get a pulse from the GO2 project, you don't want to mass that.
What, 200 feet?
Yeah, we can have them come up and
Okay.
speak.
Well, I mean, I'd have to look at the shoreline, but I mean, you could go 500, 1,000 feet, but that's for, you know, the sampling plan. Background doesn't have to be that close.
Okay, thank you.
Would you like to weigh in on that? Where you would suggest, I guess, the background tests?
Jim Borback from OHI Engineering. We'd go up, I would go quite a ways away from the template, both north and south. And because I want to know what necessarily background is, you know, over a wide area, and do a few locations both north and south. So not just one sample to the north and one sample to the south, but I'd do more than that.
Okay.
And so that's what we would do.
Thank you.
So let's just immediately vote so that they can catch the boat. Okay, yeah. So,
Could the sampling plan be submitted to Jeff for review and acceptance?
Sure.
So that we can get this done
Sorry,
and the results back before the next hearing?
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
So is there a motion to ask OHI to go back and retest to get background levels north and south in a couple of locations that you determine, then to go back and resample all of the other discrete test areas for nitrates, well, it's nitrogen, phosphorus, total coliform, and fecal coliform?
Just a clarification on northings and eastings. I know we're getting close to the boat. I'm a boat rider myself. The sampling that we did, the 19 samples across the top of the template, were really to map where the gray and the tan were. And so I don't see any need to go back to those specific locations. What I think would be good is if we went back to areas we know are gray and we know are tan, based on that initial sampling, and we can replicate. We can get you know, at least current on those. It's going to be very difficult and very time consuming to go and take samples at 5 feet deep when it's really not going to be add any information to the commission's decision making.
I mean, my feeling is if we need to do the whole thing, we need to do the whole thing.
Yeah, I don't want you to miss the boat, but I think that we know that I'll try to be as brief as possible. We know that the material is not uniform across the whole area. So sampling in locations that are as close to where the original sample will help us not have a problem with the mean, you know?
That we can do.
Okay. Thank you.
So is there a motion to approve or suggest that testing?
Yes, so moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second, this morning.
Okay.
Okay.
So by voice vote, are you in approval, Phillips?
Aye.
Topham,
Aye.
Golding eye.
Arisman, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Beal,
Good luck in catching the boat.
That carries unanimously.
Thank you.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
Oh my goodness. Island life.
Check your watch.
Yeah, but sorry,
I know, but you know.
They got plenty of time. I showed up for you in this before.
plenty of money to pay consultants to stay overnight, so it shouldn't rush the process, is my feeling.
It's more than wanting to get back to their families. I totally agree with you.
And I certainly appreciate being able to call this.
Well, Greg, I think you're off the hook if you wanna bail.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Will do. Yes, feel free to get in touch with anything else.
Okay.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Greg.
Okay, so
Good night.
moving on, reports, crack.
Crack, while we're continuing to hammer away at the RFP.
Okay. CPC.
No change.
Okay.
No meetings.
NP and EDC.
I missed last week's meeting, so I'm sorry, I don't have an update.
Okay. So commissioners.
Our condolences.
Yes, absolutely, Maureen.
Oh, thank you, yeah, it's been hard, you know, kind of one too many in a row in our family.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Moving on to commissioners' comments. I know Ian has.
Well, I do, and friends of mine called and asked me to look at the land bank's replacement for their path going their boardwalk going out at 50 Tennessee Avenue, and the thing looks like the Maginot Line. It's just these massive piles going all the way out, and I just thought to myself, I can't believe that I permitted this, and so
we'll get everyone. We went out and viewed the site, and we're just reconciling the plan on count, everything. So we'll get everyone a written report to review before the end of the week.
And could we see the actual original application and the, you know, what their NOI was?
Yes.
Because.
So we'll compare. We'll do an analysis, and we'll send everyone the original materials.
Thanks.
That everyone can take a look.
Thank you. Any other commissioners' comments? No. All right. Administrator staff reports.
Sorry, this is something I should have said at public comment at the beginning, and thank goodness that Joanne's here to remind me. Just a reminder: next meeting is not here. It is in the cafeteria or in the cafeteria at the high school.
Worst of them all.
Sorry, it's the
But
only
food
room we
will be
have.
served.
Hopefully they sanitize the tables before you have to sit there.
Oh, I didn't think of that.
You're
Thank
welcome.
So we'll be good. The good news is actually we'll have the shortest commute of all. So
Well, and I may
Unless she
be
goes home in between.
I may be out on the West Coast, so I may be calling in.
And are our site visits at 4?
Yep. Oh, yeah, that's correct too. And site visits are moving
Oh.
back to 4 because
Thank
time
you.
changes as well.
Yeah.
We will send out an email reminder to everybody for both.
Really?
Yeah,
There's no phone in the cafeteria. Can I call in on your cell phone then?
We will arrange to make sure you, if you would like to call in, that you can call in.
Thank you.
We will puzzle that out somehow.
Okay. Well,
Service is not.
We can't. This room is occupied for something else. And
well, after Joe
we-
sacrificed
Joanne
his
spent the
skiing
better
time,
part
I
of,
feel
like,
he
2
set
days
the bar
looking for a
very high.
space, and that it's just an available space that meets the criteria for a public meeting space.
How about your office?
It's too
Too
small.
small.
You think?
What's any word on the old fire station?
We are slowly making progress towards that project moving forward. So
Okay, thanks.
it's a
So
town
slowly
project.
moving
Slowly
progress is
moving.
like 10 years from now we'll be in there.
It is a town-run project.
So is that an HDC-approved construction in the parking lot there by the fire station?
That is
They
not
are.
my department and
They are
not my
HDC approved, that's why they're shingled. Those things were
and
at
not
the school.
my responsibility.
They were at the school.
We're gonna continue, that's gonna stay there.
No, we need to make a motion to adjourn.
Right.
All right. Seth made a motion to adjourn.
Move
Okay.
to
Is
adjourn.
there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
No, they're trying to figure out what.
Great job.